H.R. 6952, the Fiscal State of the Nation Act, and H.R. 6957, the Debt to GDP Transparency and Stabilization Act, in that order. To ensure we have the flexibility to accommodate the schedule, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess at any time and the committee delay any request for roll call vote without objection. So ordered. I now yield myself such time as I may consume for an opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues, we started this journey as a team, as a budget committee team, not Republican or Democrat, but members of the United States House of Representatives Budget Committee, with a tremendous responsibility and opportunity. And we had a fiscal state of the nation, which I thought was excellent, bipartisan panel. We looked at the federal government's balance sheet, our revenues and expenditures, and the unfunded liabilities out 30 years, where we added we will add $120 trillion to the already record levels of debt. We will increase our debt to GDP according to CBO, nonpartisan scorekeeping agency, from 125%, which is the highest gross debt to GDP in the history of our country, to well over 200%. We looked at CBO's projections over the 10-year horizon and noted with all of us with great concern that our annual deficits will double and our interest payments will triple. And by the way, CBO projected that our deficit last year, Mr. Panetta, would, at the front end of their projections, would be $1.6 trillion. Brother, it is 2.6. They were off by $1 trillion. That's not a rounding error, even by federal government standards. $2.6 trillion. So all of this we heard with concern and conviction, and hopefully with resolve to do something about it. This was all before, if you recall, the Fitch credit downgrade, before Moody's outlook downgrade from stable to negative. This was before the Treasury bond market showed signs of softening. This was before Treasury announced it would need to borrow $250 billion coming out of August in the final quarter of the fiscal year. This was before Treasury said that they would need to borrow $1.5 trillion in the fourth quarter of this past calendar year and first quarter of this year. 2 quarters, $1.5 trillion. This was before CBO missed their projections by $1 trillion. Suffice it to say, things have not gotten worse, and the signs are only indicating that our federal government's budget and spending and deficit is coming off the rails. At the time of our first hearing, we also agreed that we've all contributed to this, that no party gets a pass on this. I mean, I have my views on spending, and some of my colleagues have their views on the revenue side, but we're all guilty as the two political parties in this country, the major political parties, of not being responsible fiscal stewards. And so we all own this, and we're all in the boat together, the boat that's sinking. And none of us want to be that generation, that first generation of American leaders who handed the country worse than we found it to our children and to the next generation of Americans. And I believe that about this committee. We also talked about the process of being broken, as I mentioned earlier. We rarely pass budgets. In fact, we passed our reverse the curse budget. I recognize it was a partisan resolution, regrettably, but it's the first time we've passed a budget in 5 years. We rarely do our appropriations. We rarely do any of this on time. We rarely enforce any of it when we do pass it. And just like this FRA, where I agree we did a deal, we ought to stick to the deal, But members of Congress voted on the FRA as it was written in the piece of paper, not with all these side deals that our four-corner leaders and the president agreed to. And they used this off-balance sheet gimmicks, chimps, emergency spending. Basically, we keep two sets of books. And I think it's unconscionable. And the citizens of our country, if they ran their businesses like this, they go to jail. So we'll just pause now while this gentleman is escorted off. More political theater, by the way. Let's.
Keep your hands off Social Security. I have a petition here from over half of
Thank you, sir.
Americans who say, keep your hands off of Social Security. We don't need a smoky back room.
Take care of this gentleman,
I would
please.
like you to listen to the American people when they say absolutely no cuts to Social Security. A vote for a commission is a vote to cut Social Security. No cuts to Social Security. No cuts to Social Security.
Well, speaking of gimmicks, I hope we can all see past these tactics that keep us from doing the right and responsible things for the American people. So, and by the way, they happen on all sides. And nope, again, I hope we can come at this as leaders, not as members of a political party. So we talked about the broken process, and one of the things we also do is we hyper-focus on 1/3 of the budget, discretionary. And Mr. Boyle, we rarely spend the time on the 2/3 of mandatory spending that is the bigger driver of the debt. And so Fitch, I think, the credit agency, and Moody's give us some insight to why we're here today and why it's important to have this fiscal commission. They said that, among other things, they're concerned about the growing deficit. They talked about the drivers being mandatory spending and interest. But central to their concern and their downgrade was the lack of confidence that the United States Congress would do anything to address it, meaningful. They thought that the current hyper-partisan climate, the broken process, would not lend itself to us coming together to create a medium to long-term fiscal plan. Everything's on the table. As it should be. And so let's get serious lawmakers together in a room. Let's put everything on the table. Let's look at this unfunded liability that's going to bankrupt the country, and let's come up with a plan that will give our children the same freedom and opportunities we've had. Okay? That's why we do this. Is it perfect? No. Is any process perfect? No. And my friend Tom McClintock has made great observations, echoed by my friend Mr. Boyle. It's not the process, it's the people. Yeah, ultimately you have to have the political will. And ultimately Congress is going to have to make the decision. But incentives drive behavior. And we've just got such dysfunction here that if we could turn down the politics, if we can just dial it back, put members in a room, and hash through a plan and find some consensus solutions and take it to the floor with expedited consideration, just maybe we'll find the courage to chart a path. Where's the security? Security. I want that picture, by the way, tomorrow. Listen, I'm off script, but I think I'm on point. And I think I'm consistent. Let's take some risk here. Let's do things differently. Let's not just continue this insanity. And get, for the love of country, and I have no doubt my Democrat colleagues love this country. I think some of their policies are crazy, but I have no doubt they love this country. And so let's do this. Let's give us a fighting chance to have a better and brighter future and avoid a catastrophic and irreparable debt-related crisis, which I don't know when it comes, Mr. Boyle. I really don't. Nobody knows the trigger point. But when it happens, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's my big concern. So with that, I yield such time as my friend may consume. I know I went way over. I was a little distracted, but the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I go on the clock, or I guess it doesn't, excuse me, quite matter, but I won't abuse that. I do want to say, independent of why we're here today, this may be the very last Budget Committee meeting before one of our great members of Congress and a dear friend to me leaves Congress. Brian Higgins, proudly of Buffalo, New York, represents some relatives of mine. Brian's story represents the best of the American dream, the kind of hardworking immigrant family from which he hails, working diligently and wisely for hardworking people of Buffalo and Western New York. He has served honorably on this committee and in this institution, and we're really going to miss you, Brian.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Moving now to the subject matter of why we're here. First, let me say, and there'll be...
Are you going to miss Kildee too? Okay. Are you leaving?
You notice I refrain from commenting on Kildee leaving, but I'm just...
The record reflect that you did not say you would miss Kildee.
I am getting ready for all of the farewell parties for Dan Kildee that we'll have, but we got October, November, December. The fourth quarter of 2024 will be the Dan Kildee goodbye season. So we have many future hearings with Dan, fortunately, who's also a great member. Now on to the substance of why we're here. First, I will say, whether people are voting yes or no on the various bills in front of us, I commend the chairman for the way he has conducted this committee over the last year, 13 months, and his sincere passion for this issue. It is coming from a good place. I also want to say, about a year ago, when we kicked off our first committee hearing, we both said that this would be a committee for substance. I have been extremely distressed at the last 13 months of dysfunction and nonsense that I've seen on the House floor. By my count, I could be off on this math, so check me. I believe we have had 12 different votes this year to either censure someone, impeach someone, condemn someone, yada, yada, yada. So at least here in this committee, we aren't engaging in any of that performance art and actually dealing with substantive issues, whether one will vote yes or no on the final product. Now, on the Fiscal Commission, we've obviously had a couple of hearings before this markup. So I've already made my views on this matter pretty clear. In the end of the day, regardless of process, it comes down to people. And whether we go the regular order route or take a bit of a detour in the Fiscal Commission route, it still comes back to us, the elected representatives, who will be faced with a choice before 2033 in the case of Social Security, and before that in the case of Medicare. Either raise revenues, make cuts, or some combination of the two. And no super duper maximum blue ribbon to the extreme commission will change that fact. Now, I'm quite clear in terms of the side I come down on. I believe more revenues are needed into both the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. I actually will give credit to something that Ron DeSantis said. Yes, I was watching, I might have been the only one, who was watching the Ron DeSantis-Nikki Haley debate. You can keep your comments on what you think about my TV viewing habits or social life to yourselves. But I was watching, and Ron DeSantis said something that was accurate. He pointed out that people paid into Social Security and Medicare while they were working in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. At the times those trust funds were running surpluses. surpluses that were spent by Congresses. So it would be grossly unfair then when it's time for them to retire if all of a sudden they were facing cuts from a future commission. Now, I also want to say that the folks who support this fiscal commission, there are a number on this dais who are completely sincere and acting in good faith. But it would be naive to think that all of those who favor of a commission are acting in the same manner. There was an op-ed in the last week by a former member, Jeb Henserling in the Wall Street Journal, who flat out, and I give him credit for doing it in an upfront and above-board way, made the argument for cuts, made the argument for Social Security cuts and Medicare cuts. The point of his, and if you look at the hyperlink the Wall Street Journal used, spelled it out pretty clear. Forget the commission, we just want to go straight to the entitlement cuts, is the argument that he was making and that many others on the Wall Street Journal make. So there are absolutely those who are getting ready to use a commission as a backdoor way to force through unpopular cuts that I completely oppose and will completely oppose. I thought that the former chairman of this committee, your predecessor and my predecessor as the lead Democrat in this committee, John Yarmuth, had it right. That in the end, it comes back to people. And no commission is going to replace that reality. We need, and I will forcefully argue, for us to have the courage to vote to increase the revenues into Social Security and Medicare. And if we do that, we can put both on firm footing, as the Joint Committee on Taxation has verified. We can put both trust funds on the path to full solvency for the rest of this century. We don't need a commission to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and now we will recognize other members for, pardon me, their opening statements. If there are any technical questions about the legislation, the committee's considering today, staff will be available during opening statements to clarify any technical and or factual questions. If a member asks a question, okay, my apologies, I'm not supposed to read that part. So I yield 3 minutes now to my friend from California, Mr. Tom McClintock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are 3 numbers that tell the entire budget story. Those numbers are 48, 58, and 75. Over the last 10 years, inflation and population have grown by a combined 48%, driven by Biden's fiscal and open borders policies, 48%. Our revenues have grown 58%. So no, Mr. Ranking Member, this is not a revenue problem. And that's, by the way, after the tax cuts that the Democrats always complain about. So revenues aren't the problem. The problem is that third number, 75%. That's the increase in spending in the same period. It's still the spending stupid. When we cut taxes under Trump, our revenues did not go down. They went up because of the economic expansion that they produced. The Democrats had never understood that. Truman did, Kennedy did, but these guys don't. Until we control our spending, we are not going to solve this problem. And that's going to require members of Congress to pronounce the most abhorrent word in all of Washington, the unspeakable word, the dreaded and forbidden N-word. No. No, we can't afford to support 5 million illegal aliens that the Democrats have allowed into our country. No, we can't afford to pay able-bodied people not to work. No, we can't afford to pay massive subsidies to politically connected green energy scams. No, we can't afford to pay swarms of officials to harass our people and eat out their substance. This government sense the buck starts here, but the House can't fix it alone without 60 votes in the Senate and a president willing to join them. The only alternative is an indefinite government shutdown that would imperil our defense in very dangerous times. Passing the buck to yet another bipartisan commission is a fool's errand, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The fact is that the ultimate bipartisan budget commission is the Congress. And unless and until Congress rises to its responsibility, we're going to continue down this road. Nor do we need more reports. We know what's wrong. The process isn't broken, it's ignored. Now, having said all that, I'm still going to support this commission and the other bills because at least I think they provide another forum to raise the issue. But I hold little hope that they'll result in any substantive process. Only Congress can do that. And at some point, reality is going to overtake us. The fact is, socialism doesn't work any better here than everywhere else in the world has been tried. And as Margaret Thatcher famously warned, sooner or later you run out of other people's money. Argentina is the latest country to confront this harsh reality. It's not a new commission, but rather a new Congress and a new president. We're willing to pronounce the word no that we need before we can restore the fiscal discipline and prosperity that fiscal discipline produces. And that can only be done by the American people. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California, and just please indulge me for one key point. I think if all we do is raise the awareness and educate the American people and bring them along, I wish every member could serve on this committee, and I wish every citizen of our country could tune in so that the public sentiment would put the appropriate pressure, Democrat and Republican, on elected officials to come up here and do what they need to do. And I pray at least we can do that, and those kitchen table conversations will not just be about the border or about foreign wars, but they will be about the battle that we're in for the fiscal health of this country. Mr. Higgins, I echo my ranking member sentiments. You're a friend, and you've been a great colleague on Ways and Means and here in the budget. We're going to miss you. Congratulations on your service to our country and this new chapter in your life. I yield 3 minutes to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. Appreciate this very much. The United States is 5% of the world's population. We are 25% of the world's economy. When you look at the growth of the American economy as it relates to the world economy, of the G7 economies, we had 48% of the world's wealth 20 years ago. Now it's over 58%. America, the US dollar is the go-to currency in the world. 85% of global transactions are based on the dollar. We have a strong and vibrant economy. The Harvard economist Peter Drucker said that the whole purpose of creating an economy is to create a middle class, because the middle class pays our taxes, they fight our wars, they teach our kids, they protect our neighborhoods. It is vital to have a strong middle class. The chairman said that everything is on the table, everything but tax equity. You know, there was a previous IRS commissioner that provided testimony to the United States Senate saying that $1 trillion is lost every single year because of the inadequacy of the Internal Revenue Service. And now we're in a process of cutting the very resources that are necessary to keep the Internal Revenue Service functional relative to the state of our economy. And there's too much talk about fiscal responsibility without taking fiscal action that supports that contention. What do I mean by that? You know, the federal government, nearly $7 trillion of an annual budget, is 23% of the American economy. When you don't essentially make a budget for 25 years, when this fiscal year is 30% done without essentially having a budget, that does real damage to the American economy, because economic stability and growth is based on stability, predictability, and that's very, very important and a big responsibility of this committee. So I want to just encourage this committee to take decisive action relative to tax fairness. You know, when you look at, in the end, because of a lot of machinations as it relates to what wealthy people are able to do, a teacher in America, after filing as a single filer, pays 22% of their taxes. A firefighter, 22% in taxes. Jeff Bezos, $99 billion in income, pays less than 1%. So if everything's on the table, the most important thing, I believe, is tax fairness, and we have to achieve this through this process. With that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New York, and now yield 3 minutes to my friend Buddy Carter from the great state of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for undertaking this. This is something all of us, I think, recognize that we need to do. I'm thrilled to see this committee and the Congress get serious about saving and securing. That's the key, saving and security, not cutting, saving and securing the future of our Social Security and Medicare programs. This isn't politically popular, I get that, but at our current pace, cuts to these programs are guaranteed if the programs continue to exist at all. How are we going to explain that to our constituents when the program they paid for and paid into for their entire working lives evaporates? Who among us is going to look a senior citizen in the eye and say that they cannot retire because we failed to balance our budget? I've heard false narratives that label us as heartless for wanting to reform our vital safety net programs, but we're not the ones with our heads in the sand. We're advocating for a smarter approach that sustains these essential programs well into the future so generations to come can also use them. Every single one of us in this body, every one of us, promised in one way or another to make this country better for future generations. We may disagree on the how, but we all share the belief that it is up to us to secure this nation's future. As a healthcare provider, I know firsthand the critical role that programs such as Medicaid and Medicare play in people's lives. It's vital that people get the life-saving medications they need at an affordable price. The Congressional Budget Office has suggested that, had Congress acted on Social Security reform 2 decades ago, our largest spending program could have been made solvent with only a modest impact on the incomes of average retirees. However, we didn't act. This must happen now, not in the future, but now. Not reforming our entitlement programs means accepting drastic cuts and a true break of our promise. I, for one, refuse to accept that. Today, we find ourselves over $34 trillion in debt. That equates to borrowing $5 billion a day. The over $6 trillion we spend in fiscal year 23, which equates to over $200,000 a second, is faster than the speed of light at 186,000 miles per second. We are spending money faster than the speed of light. However, we know that most of that spending is not controlled at Congress's discretion. We could cut all the money that Congress appropriates annually and barely make a dent in the long-term fiscal health of our nation. One frightening example of this is by 2027, if we don't act now, the interest alone on our debt will surpass our annual spending on national defense. As President Reagan said best, we don't have $1 trillion debt because we haven't taxed enough. We have $1 trillion debt because we spend too much. It's become evident we need a bipartisan, bicameral fiscal committee because reining in spending through regular House order just isn't cutting it anymore. I know getting our spending under control is a bipartisan issue, and the fact we are even here today is a testament to the leadership of Speaker Johnson and Chairman Arrington. Look, folks, this process won't be easy. However, it will be tough, and unpopular decisions need to be made to keep our promises to the American people. I look forward to voting for H.R. 5997 and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia, and now yield 3 minutes to my friend from Michigan, Mr. Dan Kildee, who we will miss in the next Congress. I will. Eventually. Irrespective of your ranking member, I will be there to miss you.
Someday you'll miss me. Well, thank you for that, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Boyle as well for your comments, but for holding this important markup. As we discuss legislation related to a fiscal commission, I do want to acknowledge, as has been mentioned, that there are many places where Democrats and Republicans agree, even on the budget priorities for this country. It's often difficult to find that area of agreement, but there are places where we can come together. And as I've said before, recently the President and the Speaker of the House, even the previous Speaker, negotiated a bipartisan budget agreement that cuts some spending and begins to responsibly, carefully address our national deficit. This agreement critically protected Social Security and Medicare, which is the subject of a lot of this discussion, the programs that are important to millions of Americans. When we voted on this bipartisan agreement, 314 members of Congress, a majority of both parties, voted for this compromise. And so I'm hopeful that Speaker Johnson and the Republican conference will uphold that bipartisan deal to avoid a government shutdown and to govern responsibly. When it comes to our national budget, for myself, one of my top priorities, of course, is protecting Social Security, strengthening Social Security and Medicare. Americans contribute to Social Security and Medicare throughout their entire lifetimes, and they rightfully expect that those programs will be there for them when they retire. That's the deal. When you work hard, you play by the rules, you make those contributions, you ought to be able to retire with dignity. And that's why I've introduced legislation affirming the House of Representatives' commitment to protect and strengthen Social Security and Medicare and rejecting cuts to those programs. The legislation raises, this particular legislation that we're considering raises some legitimate concerns that a fiscal commission can pave the way for cuts to Social Security and Medicare. So my issue with fiscal commissions of the past is that they have prioritized cutting spending and have not focused on making our tax code more fair for workers and families. And Mr. Higgins made, I think, a very important point about the unfair aspects of the tax code. So Americans deserve a government that's fiscally responsible and is working to lower our national debt. But we have to do that ensuring that the tax code makes the wealthiest individuals and the biggest corporations pay their fair share, not by advancing cuts to Social Security and Medicare. So with that, I have to oppose this legislation. I don't believe that we will see the priority on revenues that we ought to, and I disagree that it's just a spending problem. When the wealthiest individuals in this country just don't pay their fair share, we can't look the other way and pretend that the only solution is to cut programs that are designed to benefit the people who need it most. With that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan and now yield 3 minutes to my friend from the mother of all states, Virginia.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. And I thank him for his leadership on this issue, and I thank the ranking member for engaging in an important conversation. The need for fiscally conservative policies could not be more evident. The question is whether Congress has the will to actually enact them. The national debt surpassing $33 trillion, the cost of paying down the interest alone is becoming increasingly untenable, with projections indicating that interest costs will surpass national defense spending by 2028. This Congress, House Republicans have sought to reclaim the broken appropriations process in an effort to replace the blowout omnibus spending bills of the past for regular order and the passage of responsible and conservative single-issue appropriations bills. However, spending has been put on autopilot as nearly 2/3 of our annual spending consists of mandatory programs. This spending has been placed outside of the regular oversight of Congress. In 2022, total mandatory spending made up 71% of the federal budget. Since 2000, other mandatory spending, which includes categories outside of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, has risen above CBO baseline projections by $724 billion, more than any other category of spending. The lack of congressional review of this spending is in direct conflict with our Constitution, the edict that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And to make matters worse, the trust funds for Medicare, hospital insurance, and Social Security will face insolvency by 2031 and 2033, resulting in immediate across-the-board cuts of 11% and 23%, respectively. We cannot allow that to happen. Today's markup is to serve as the Budget Committee's opening salvo for 2024 and includes legislation that will provide Congress with additional policy tools to put our nation's finances on the right track. Among them are bipartisan bills to establish an annual fiscal State of the Nation address, enhance reporting requirements within the President's budget, as well as to create a bipartisan fiscal commission which will serve this Congress in a supplementary role by developing policy solutions to address the debt and bringing them to the House floor for a vote. To be clear, the role of this fiscal commission is not and should not be to supplant the responsibilities of this committee or the two committees that have traditionally been driving our debt, Appropriations, on which I serve, and Ways and Means. Many of those members are here on this committee. Instead, this commission should be complementing those efforts. And I am looking forward to building off the work that we're starting today to deliver concrete results for the American people in 2024. Thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Klein, and now yield 3 minutes to our friend from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is clearly a daunting issue. I think it captures the attention of people on this committee. I've made no secret of the fact that my solution is simply for Congress to do its job, to be able to collect taxes that are already due and payable, not a new tax, but the billions of dollars that people forget to declare on their income. I've also been unwavering in my commitment that we ought to deal with oversight of spending programs. The notion that somehow the Defense Department should be off limits, when we all know egregious examples of wasteful spending, like I won't flog the battleship issue any further, but the Navy doesn't want it, it doesn't work, we keep it simply to provide jobs in Florida. Now, this should not be our approach to dealing with the budget deficit. There are many examples. If we had the same scrutiny that some of my colleagues want to exercise for human resource programs, would examine the Pentagon budget, we would be making huge advances in reducing the deficit. But I want to just be clear that while I don't think that there's a solution absent doing our job, raising revenues that are already due and payable, and having oversight of spending, I have no quarrel about people who want to come together and think about the way that the commission may be able to help ease moving forward on that. It's an exercise of cooperation, learning what the choices are, working together, showing good faith, and I think the chairman and ranking member are exhibiting good faith in the way that they've managed this, dealing with the various opinions on the budget committee. I think it's possible that some good can come from it. The stakes are high enough that we ought to take that risk to be able to move forward. But as I say, it's no substitute for Congress not doing its job. I'm hopeful that this would be a step in the process of helping Congress do that. So I will support it, but I will be focusing on these larger issues that are going to be required if we're truly going to get the deficit under control. Thank you, and I yield back.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and now yield to our friend from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and would that we would listen to the folks from Virginia as we listened to the folks from Virginia 250 years ago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for everyone who's done work to bring us to this point and to bring these bills forward for a markup. The current economic and fiscal outlook for our country is bleak thanks to Bidenomics and Biden inflation. The national debt, as has been said and will be said over and over, has ballooned to an astounding record, to say the least, $34 trillion, which means that each person in the U.S. has a debt obligation of over $100,000, and household debt is over $250,000. And this is an existential threat to the country. I would submit, along with the border invasion, the two greatest existential threats to the country. Our federal debt as a share of GDP, or the size of our economy, is about 120%. Just 15 years ago, prior to the Great Recession, the federal debt as a share of GDP was only about 60%, so it's approximately doubled relative to the size of our economy in 15 years. Can you imagine if that happens again in the next several years, as we're on track to do? America's fiscal situation cannot improve unless we take immediate action to address, again, what is one of the biggest threats to our country, our spending, our deficit, which is about $200 billion a month, $200 billion a month deficit, and the national debt, which has grown at the rate of around $2.5 trillion a year now. So for every 4 or 5 months, another trillion here, trillion there, sooner or later you get to real money. Americans' national debt has grown so out of control that, of course, as has been said many times, and it bears repeating, that our interest on the debt alone is approaching the largest budget item, will soon exceed that we spend on national defense. The number one priority, theoretically, of this federal government to protect the safety and security of Americans, including their constitutional liberties, by the way. So this situation is obviously serious. It's got to be addressed. So I'm encouraged that we're taking this step, that the Budget Committee here is leading the charge and establishing the Fiscal Commission, which we know is only as valuable as the willingness of Congress to actually implement what we discover. But still, it's an important step to address our nation's addiction to spending, or at least Congress's addiction to spending, and our reluctance to make change unless it's forced upon us. So this commission will have a mandate to meaningfully improve our nation's fiscal outlook, and I'm encouraged that we have this charge to do just that. It's imperative that the members of the commission realize that to truly improve the situation, there must be bipartisan commitment to cutting spending. We don't have a revenue problem. We got record revenue coming in. We have a spending problem. This is an important opportunity for us that we must not squander. Previous commissions have helped us save Social Security, consolidate military bases, and do other big projects to help this country. And this is an important opportunity for us today, and I hope everyone will be committed to seeing this through and implementing this. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, Mr. Good, for your comments. As I yield the floor now to the author of this bill and a very good friend, I hearken back to 4 years ago as we entered into the pandemic and tremendous COVID spending, some of which I thought was appropriate, some of which I thought was unnecessary, but nonetheless, we both agreed that we better get a handle on this, and we better put some eyes on it, and we better put some wise counsel to consider the cost and the implications. 30 Democrats and 30 Republicans came together to support a few ideas, one of them being a debt commission. Scott, you've led the charge. I appreciate that leadership and that courage, and I'm glad that it's sort of come to fruition, at least at this point, for a hearing, and I certainly expect it to pass. Again, thank you for your leadership. I yield 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very kind. Thanks for holding this markup. You know, regular order, it just kind of makes me smile. Regular order is the congressional Bigfoot. We're all told it exists, and none of us has ever seen it. I've been here 11 years. I don't even know what regular order is, and I'm told that regular order will solve this problem. I don't believe it. Most people don't believe it either. Just recently, in October, Paul Krugman, the award-winning, Nobel Prize-winning economist, generally argues that debt has not been something to be concerned about, writes an article that I ask unanimous consent be put into the record, why we should but won't reduce the budget deficit. Now, he's telling us that this is a problem. He doesn't believe Congress will take care of it. He's not arguing for a commission, but nobody thinks, and there's no evidence to suggest that this issue will be taken up without a different approach, and that's what we're proposing today. The gentleman at the beginning who started with a little protest about not cutting Social Security, sure, I'm with him, but I really think he's got it wrong, as I've said before. Social Security cuts are baked into the law right now. If we go another 10 years and the lines cross, it's a 24% across the board cut. That's in existing law. Whether you're 72 or 92, rich or poor, you're gonna get cut. Now, we could pretend that doing nothing is gonna solve that problem. We could pretend that regular order is gonna take care of it. I choose to offer a different path. I don't think that's gonna work. I don't think anyone thinks it's gonna work. I don't think anyone who's 30 years old today thinks that there's anything in Social Security for them. I want to save it. I don't want to cut benefits. But the dynamic we face is that the longer we wait, the longer we creep toward 24% cuts across the board, the more leverage we give to the people who want to cut benefits. Because the day before it's a 24% cut, they're going to say, how's a 15% cut for you? If we act today, maybe we can avoid that. Maybe we can really, because we already have a weak social safety net in this country, maybe we could avoid that, but not by waiting. And by the way, if you want something out in public, waiting is just going to give you that backroom deal the night before that happened in 1983 that resulted in cuts. I've been we'll maybe speak a little bit to it later, but we sought a lot of input from across the board. I heard comments from Mr. Doggett, who noted that our bill did not explicitly include a commitment to produce recommendations on revenue measures. We thought that was implicit. We put it into the bill. Mr. Blumenauer asked for more public input. We thought that was obvious, but it wasn't. We put it into the bill. I think that we've talked to other members of the Progressive Caucus who are worried that the benefits of the investments you make if you borrow money that come back to the budget won't be accounted for. We put that into the bill, and the majority has been cooperative on that way. If I thought that we could do this without a commission, I'd be happy to do it, but I just think it's obvious that it's not. This is a way to get started. And if we come up with something that doesn't have revenues in it, or that puts this on the backs of federal employees who have already done their part, and isn't equitable, we're not going to vote it onto the floor, and it's not going to get voted if it gets on the floor. So we have a lot of protection. Let's do something about this. This makes sense, and I ask for my colleagues' support. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California, somebody that's already started a fiscal commission in his own district, and they meet and talk about these things. They're still waiting for us to stop talking and do something about it. Blake Moore from Utah. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've expressed to you in our personal conversations, being a part of reversing debt culture was the main thing that I ran on. It's the main reason I'm here. It's the main reason that I fly across the country to come back and fight for this. I wish I could also wave the magic wand of what Mr. Peters says of regular order and making it all, we need a catalyst. I don't know any other way to put it. I've watched from the sidelines, not in Congress for the last 20 years, and we pitter-patter around the edges on this stuff. We need a catalyst to go after the number one issue our country faces. And that's not taking it out of the hands of us members of Congress, it's actually empowering us. What we're doing today is empowering us. We're going through the order of putting this process together so we have an opportunity to find the best case scenario that we will vote on. They will all be a part of our order. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do something substantive today. There's so much that we go through back here that just isn't. And I appreciate Chairman for his voice on this. It means the world to me to be able to tell my constituents I want to go back there for a particular reason and to be able to help deliver on that particular reason. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an op-ed that I wrote in The Hill on the necessity of establishing a fiscal commission to address our country's fiscal health.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Again, earlier this year, we surpassed $34 trillion. I tend to look in debt to GDP more, and that's even more dangerous of a number than even just the $34 trillion. And we're approaching a level that, we've talked about. Well, we did it in World War II. The factors at play are so different than they were in World War II. We actually could take the reins and control things better after World War II because we could address defense more. We're now spending the lowest percentage of GDP on defense as we ever have. That's not a lever that we can necessarily pull to make this work. Our direct mandatory spending has eclipsed 2/3 of our budget because of inaction, right? And what we want to do today is take action to do what we were all elected to do and make logical, thoughtful, productive decisions on how to address all this. We're on a path to irreversible economic harm. I have 4 young boys. It's killing me as their dad that they'll be raising their own young families, trying to save for their first homes in 2053, and the interest on debt payments may take up to 40% of all revenues. This is an opportunity to act, to address our debt to GDP ratio, to look at what we're doing, things that we don't vote on an annual basis, to just what is right by our seniors, what is right by our Gen X, the next generation to retire. We did not prepare for the current situation we're in. Let's get out ahead of it. Let's do something right by the American people to set ourselves up for success. And just again, want to thank the group and the individual who's been working on this. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill, and I look forward to in supporting some of the other things we're doing today as well, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Utah representing the God-fearing, freedom-loving people of Texas, Mr. Lloyd Doggett, for 3 minutes. You like that introduction?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership here. I have always viewed this fiscal commission as neither a panacea nor a disaster. It is important that revenues be considered along with spending, and I appreciate the efforts that our colleague, Mr. Peters, has made along with the chairman to see that this revised version of the bill includes consideration of revenues. Some of the comments that have been made this morning about how we have no revenue problem, it's only a spending problem, I view as really a fantasy. We see how fantastic they are with reference to the appropriation bills for this year. Republicans cannot pass bills in the House on appropriations this year because they can't get their own members to vote for some of these bills because the cuts in spending are so draconian and would so undermine educational opportunity and health care and other vital needs of our country. This time tomorrow morning, the Ways and Means Committee will convene to embark on what the chairman of that committee says will lock in $600 billion in additional corporate tax cuts. Just as with any family budget, if you cut your earnings, that can put you into a disastrous debt spiral just as quickly as if you spend too much. And some of the same people who are today raving about the trouble we have from too much spending and too big a debt will be the first to champion this locking in $600 billion in additional debt. I consider the need for a commission every time I see the failure of the Congress, of the Ways and Means Committee, to take some of the tough votes that are necessary to contain healthcare costs. And so what we're doing now is not enough. I have some legislation, it's along the lines of what President Biden has proposed to expand Medicare solvency. I think that there is a real concern out there that this commission will be called the Cut Social Security Commission. Mr. Boyle has some amendments to try to address this and to see that Social Security receives reasonable protection. I support those amendments. I can support a fiscal commission, but not without greater protection for Social Security than the current bill offers. I would encourage the chair, if he cannot support the specific language that Mr. Boyle is advancing, to work with us to ensure that the guarantee of Social Security is not lost. Providing additional protection in this measure for Social Security is important because there have been so many efforts by Republicans through the years to cut it. If we want strong public confidence in a fiscal commission, it needs to be clear from the outset that Social Security will receive the protection that is so important to millions of Americans. And I yield back.
I thank my friend from Texas and now yield to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Miss Michelle Fischbach. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And has been noted, the country's national debt currently stands at $34 trillion. That's roughly 120% of GDP. That's roughly $102,000 per household. That's $102,000 that American households cannot afford. And just to put that dollar figure in more context, the median household income in 2022 was $74,580. Now think of those two numbers. The federal government has been spending the taxpayer dollars irresponsibly for too long, and it is time for a change. Both the Fiscal State of the Nation Act and the Debt to GDP Stabilization Act work to increase transparency for the American people to see what the government is spending their money on and if they are doing it responsibly. For example, the debt to GDP bill, sorry, it's like a tongue twister this morning, requires the president's annual budget submission to include the current ratio of the public debt to the estimated gross domestic product, providing greater transparency and insight into the government's approach to managing public debt in relation to overall economic output. This country has been ignoring the debt for far too long, and we cannot afford to ignore it any longer. These bills are smart, simple ways to keep this conversation at top of mind, and it is time we take this issue seriously and do something. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your work on this. You have been vigilant about making sure that we are moving forward in this committee, and so I appreciate that, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Minnesota. And another gentleman who deserves a lot of credit, who's exerted tremendous leadership, and is a reason we're here today. One of the founding members of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, formerly known as 30 for 30, Jimmy Panetta. Again, thanks for your leadership on this. You have 3 minutes from the great state of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Ranking Member Boyle. Look, I think, prior to coming to Congress, all of us probably had certain views of how the Budget Committee and its responsibilities, what they should be, especially when it comes to our debt and deficits. I'd seen Congress tackle fiscal challenges and believed the work of committees like this one were charged to ensure that we legislated in a fiscally responsible manner. That is why I'm a member of this committee, as well as the bipartisan working groups like the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, in which we hope to continue to work on fiscal issues. Unfortunately, given the politics, given the fear that is out there, it's been difficult to make serious progress on fiscal responsibility. As I said before in hearings leading up to this markup, we've lost the political will to rein in our growing deficits and spiraling debt. Fortunately, there are groups like Chairman Arrington's original 30 for 30, which is now the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, led by Reps. Peters and Huizenga, that have held discussions about how to solve this crisis. And during those talks, it became clear that a fiscal commission was our best answer as to how we come up with a comprehensive plan to get our fiscal house in order, as to how we solve the challenges that plague our current politics, as to how we get the will to do the right thing when it comes to reducing our debt and deficit before it's too late, before another crisis comes to our shores that we must deal with. The goal is not to circumvent regular order. The goal is not to just make cuts or just add revenues. The goal is to push us to put a pathway on paper that looks seriously at our budgets and how we better balance them. And yes, looks seriously at all options to do that. That's why I'm supportive of today's legislation and why we need a commission to take on this challenge. Well, there will be some hard conversations. We've made clear that this will be a public process. It will be vastly preferable process than the current way of governing by crisis. And it's vastly preferable than the current process when we were up against a deadline and left with few choices, where we end up punting our major policy decisions to our party's leadership with little room for dissent and no real time for debate. At the end of the day, the recommendations must still pass with votes in the House and Senate. And unlike in a crisis, should the recommendations prove unpopular, we can reject them. Congress can reject them. Make no mistake, there are real consequences to fiscal irresponsibility, but action is needed. We will soon spend more on debt interest payments than on our military defense. And payments on our interest will threaten future investments in our families and in our nation. A lack of action to shore up our trust funds means that we're facing steep cuts, as you heard from Representative Peters. Cuts to our Social Security, cuts in Medicaid in less than a decade. We should be afraid of that. But Mr. Chairman, when it comes to fear, let's use that fear to motivate us to do the right thing and not let it prevent us from doing anything. We must act. That's our job. Let's start with finding the will to do it, and that begins with the Fiscal Commission. That's why I support H.R. 5779. the Fiscal Commission Act, and I yield back.
Well said, Mr. Panetta. Thank you for your remarks. Now yield 3 minutes to our friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Josh Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and excited that to set a structure up that hopefully will come back with an amazing way to solve a problem that is, it looks insurmountable right now. The Treasury report that I think some of us would have read from even a couple of years ago talked about that it's not just the public debt, the publicly held debt, it's the insolvencies within Medicare and Social Security. And so if you take the 30+ trillion in publicly held debt and you add the 75-year sustainability for Medicare and Social Security, even after the 1983 fix, we find ourselves, according to the Treasury report under the Biden administration, we're at $124 trillion. That's the real size of our indebtedness. And they said in that report that if you take that and you assess that against all property in America, all privately held assets, it's 86% of all privately held wealth in America. And that means if everybody listening will just sell everything you've got, sell everything, then you can retain 14% and we can get flush with the house. We have an unsurmountable problem because of our selfishness and because we pretend. We love to talk about the size of these problems. We love to cite the numbers, but line upon line and precept upon precept, $1 million here, $1 million there, authorized, not with a revenue stream to pay for it. The question I have to ask myself every day, am I operating in hypocrisy? Am I voting on things that I know is adding to this problem, or am I being true? And so I think all of us have got to just be intellectually honest with one another and with the American people. I love the fact that a part of this commission result, Mr. Chairman, a part of your amendment process is a public education. Because in addition to setting up a structure that comes back with recommendations or how are we going to solve this problem, the American people have to know that blanket truth is this: there will be pain. There will be hardship because we have exhausted resources from our kids and our grandkids. And when you have an entire discretionary budget, it used to be a few years ago, I came up here, it's a third of our spending was discretionary. Now we're moving to where a fourth of what we spend the discretionary is going to be something that Congress appropriates, and 3/4 is mandatory. And so every time we lock aside another program, another benefit into mandatory spending, shame on us. Shame on us. And so all of us need to be operating in truth. The American people have to have the truth. We have to make sure the American people know the facts, that the pain is coming. Medicare, Social Security within 10 years insolvency, the pain is coming. And the midnight ride for us is to educate the American people so that we'll make the choice of sacrificing, not the sacrifice being forced upon us. Now, with that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. Appreciate his remarks. Ms. Ballant, I yield 3 minutes to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The aim of the Fiscal Commission is, broadly speaking, I think, a noble effort. I think we all understand that crushing debt and massive deficits aren't healthy for the U.S. economy or for the democracy as a whole. As a parent, I, of course, worry about what this will mean for my children. And as the former leader of the Vermont State Senate, I understand the importance of working with colleagues across the aisle to pass balanced budgets that funded our state government every year. We found ways to do that required compromise, hard work, late nights, and I still welcome the opportunities with my Republican colleagues to address our nation's real challenges. But we already have the tools that we need. There are already solutions that work. And the chair said that this proposed commission, that in this commission, everything's on the table. And therein, for me, lies the problem. I disagree that everything should be on the table. There are some things that should absolutely not be on the table. And that's because the wealth gap in this country is obscene. I cannot and will not support cuts to Social Security, to Medicare, to nutrition programs for children and young families, for veterans benefits, for disability insurance. These programs provide vital support to regular people and improve not just our nation's economy, but the well-being of the democracy. And they offer Americans a lifeline from crushing, grinding poverty. Nearly 67 million Americans depend on Social Security for benefits, and it's frankly indefensible that right now in homes across our nation, there are elders who are trying to make the decision between medication, food, housing. We should be talking about strengthening Social Security, and it should not be on the table. Now, I talked to a lot of Vermonters, like all Americans, and they love their freedoms. And they want us to be fighting for fairness. I hear these two things probably more than anything. They want a fair shot. They want to know that they're not getting gouged while others continue to grow their great wealth. They want tax fairness. They want us to ensure that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. This does not make them socialists. We know that increasing enforcement of tax collection raises revenue and benefits our economy. And Americans overwhelmingly support these measures. This, again, does not make them socialists. I mention this because my colleague earlier in this hearing brought up the hackneyed, tired specter of socialism. I urge us to be more intellectually honest here. Wanting freedom and fairness does not make one a socialist. Let's get serious about closing the wealth gap. I don't feel this commission will do that. Let's focus on what the majority of Americans want, which is freedom and tax fairness. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady from Vermont. Now yield 3 minutes to my good friend Chip Roy from the great state of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. A note to the ranking member that I had a front row seat to Governor DeSantis' comments that he referred to earlier. Last Thursday, I flew to St. Louis. Flight was canceled, drove 8 hours through the blizzard of Des Moines. Spent a lot of time in Iowa last week, New Hampshire yesterday. Got up at 4 in the morning, came here this morning. Bring that up because I spent a lot of time with people not in Texas over the last week. Every single one of them, New Hampshire, Iowa, airports, South Carolina, pit stop in South Carolina the day before yesterday. Every single one of them are beside themselves at the rote incompetence and absurdity that is this body. All of us. Every stinking last one of us. Every single person I talk to cannot understand how a body that is supposed to be representative of the people comes here and manages to make this country worse on a daily basis, no matter who's in the majority. I defy anybody to prove me otherwise. $34 trillion of debt, and we have my Democratic colleagues saying we can't even have a conversation about Social Security, Medicare, and we have ATR and a bunch of people flipping out on our side saying you can't even have a conversation about taxes. What in the utter hell is wrong with this body? It is just mind-blowing. If you believe in modern monetary theory, then put your money where your mouth is and just get rid of taxes. Why should we have a single dollar of taxation if you believe in modern monetary theory? Just spend our children's inheritance. Do you watch the debt clock and have even a pang of guilt at your own incompetence? And I'm looking at every member of the body, both sides of the aisle, and I'm looking in the mirror. We can't even cut discretionary spending. We can't even cut bureaucrats and programs that have very little discernible value to the American citizens. And we think we're going to have a serious conversation about Social Security and Medicare? It's laughable. It is absolutely laughable. And it's an embarrassment to come back and sit here in a committee where we have colleagues shutting down any chance of bipartisan efforts to put everything on the table and do our damn job. Meanwhile, the American people are the people left holding the bag. So this bill, frankly, every one of these commissions in the past has failed. That's why we're $34 trillion in debt. I'll support this one. I hope we can do something. But right now, the American people are looking at us and wondering, what in the hell is this Congress doing for them? I yield back.
Well, I associate myself with that set of remarks from my friend from Texas and appreciate them very much. So much to say, but so little time. So I'm going to yield to Mr. Scott, our friend from Virginia, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle. Commission tasked with finding legislative solutions to improve the fiscal outlook sounds reasonable at first glance. However, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have made it part of the public record that they intend to use this commission as a Trojan horse to cut Social Security, Medicare, and other critical programs. The fact is that we know how to reduce the deficit. In the first 2 years of the Biden administration, the deficit was cut $1.7 trillion. If we need a plan to how to continue that trend, all we need to do is look at the Biden administration's budget last year, the fiscal for this budget year. The fiscal 24 budget year would cut the deficit again by nearly $3 trillion over 10 years. You can strengthen Social Security, improving the child tax credit, expand access to quality, affordable child care. It's all possible when you make wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share and raise the taxes for what spending you want to make. If we choose to stop talking and actually make fiscally responsible decisions, it would not be the first time. I was here to vote for the Clinton budget in the early 1990s. We had no help from the Republicans. Many Democrats lost their seats over that vote. And if we had continued the path of that budget set out for us, we would have fully paid off the debt held by the public by 2008. So we know how to pay off the national debt. Instead of paying off the national debt, President Bush and his party came in, passed enormous unpaid-for tax cuts, failed to pay for 2 wars, or the prescription drug benefit, and all of a sudden we're back in the ditch. President Trump followed that well-worn path, added additional $2 trillion to the annual debt, and this pattern has continued for over 60 years. Without exception, every Democratic presidential administration since Kennedy has decreased the deficit they inherited. Every Republican administration since Nixon has left for their Democratic successors an increased deficit. President Trump was well on his way to fulfilling that trend even before the pandemic. So it is not both sides. One side increases deficits, the other side decreases the deficit. Regrettably, Democrats are simply unable to clean up the mess left for them as quickly as the Republicans make the mess. And this is just not a spending problem or a taxing problem. It is a problem because we haven't taxed for what we spend. If we expect to balance the budget, our taxing must match our spending. So, Mr. Chairman, pretending that a fiscal commission will solve our unwillingness to make these difficult decisions will only delay the inevitable. And you can't pretend that complaining about it is going to actually solve the problem. No solution other than specific spending cuts or specific revenue increases or a combination will solve this problem. So I look forward to working with my colleagues to enact serious policy ideas to improve our fiscal outlook, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I hear a lean yes somewhere in your expressed sentiments, Mr. Scott. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. And now to our former Chief Deputy Whip, my good friend from Georgia, Mr. Drew Ferguson, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I sit here, I think about how many thousands of people in this country have run for office to be a member of this body since 1974, pledging to get our fiscal house in order on both sides of the aisle, pledging to secure Social Security, pledging to secure Medicare, pledging to make sure that our debt is under control. Good, meaning men and women from all across this country on both sides of the aisle that have run for office with that sentiment. And what stands in their way is not their desire, their heart. It is a badly broken budget process. I have surmised that just about every sin, the political sin that we commit in this body is due to a budget process that is broken. There are 50 acceptable pathways to failure and one pathway to success. We reward failure and delay, and we push power to the top, and we completely rob members on both sides of the aisle of the ability to have honest debate and to make real changes to what we are doing here from a legislative policy every single year. I think about my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that I know want to see our fellow Americans do just as well as my colleagues on this side of the aisle. But we have gotten to the point that we can't even have an intellectually honest conversation because of the rules that we operate under hamstring our honesty. We take scores, static scores from the Congressional Budget Office and judge things 10 years out that quite candidly are always wrong. We use political talking points at every step of the way. So one of the things that I hope that will come of this commission is not just looking at the programs and how we solve some of the problems like Medicare and Social Security, but let's please fix a broken budget process that leads us to failure year in and year out. This body and most people don't have the discipline to overcome a badly broken process. And we need a better process, Mr. Chairman. I think that is paramount. The other thing that I want to impress upon this group, and I want to impress upon the American people, is that it is time for us to lay down arms and fear-mongering when it comes to Social Security and Medicare. As the chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee, I will tell you, and I will promise my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as well as the American people, that there will not be a single bill that comes across the Ways and Means desk that cuts Social Security, period. So let's end the debate. Let's not get caught up in fear-mongering. Let's have an intellectually honest conversation. One of the biggest problems that we have is that when one side stands up and says something about Social Security, the other side immediately makes them a villain. We have to talk about every single part of that program. Waste, fraud, and abuse, improper payments, the revenue side, changes to the benefit side. All of that has got to be put into the conversation so that we can protect our seniors and those closest to retirement, and we can preserve the program. So as we move through this, Mr. Chairman, let's be intellectually honest, and let's be brave enough not to use the most important program that we have for our seniors as a political tool. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank my friend from Georgia, and now yield 3 minutes to my colleague from the great state of Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Boyle for convening us. I am challenged as to whether or not this is a solution-focused hearing. But Chairman Arrington, Democrats are ready and willing to find bipartisan solutions to America's fiscal challenges, but I will never support legislation or initiative that would put the likelihood of American families at risk. We've seen such commissions before and realize that they are challenged to do all that it is represented that they would do. History has shown that fiscal commissions are nothing more than another avenue by which my Republican colleagues would try to gut critical programs or rip away hard-earned Social Security and Medicare benefits so that they can lock in more tax cuts for billion-dollar corporations and the ultra-rich. The Greenspan Commission was the basis of Social Security amendments of 1983. Fiscal commissions have historically recommended cutting or privatizing Social Security. The Greenspan Commission resulted in a raise in the retirement age that was the equivalent to a 13% benefit cut, a tax on benefits for middle-income retirees, and the creation of the windfall elimination provision, and the government pension offset, which reduces the benefits of 2 million public servants. The President's Commission to Strengthen Social Security, established by President George W. Bush, issued a report outlining 3 models of partial privatization of Social Security. Most recently, the Bowles-Simpson Commission recommended raising the retirement age, reducing the cost of living adjustment, and reducing benefit amounts for many earners. The reality of our fiscal situation is that it was caused by tax cuts initially enacted during Republican trifectas in the past 25 years, which have slashed taxes disproportionately for the wealthy and have severely reduced federal revenues. In fact, the massive Republican tax cuts over the last 25 years have cost $10 trillion to date and are responsible for 57% of the increase to the debt ratio since 2001. It is clear that this approach of the Fiscal Commission is not the answer. Coming together and working as a combined group of Republicans and Democrats, Americans committed to the American people, that is the answer. The burdening of Social Security and putting that on the backs of our families and workers is not the answer. It means reducing Social Security and Medicare benefits instead of supporting funding for the IRS to enforce laws already on the books and making the wealthy pay the taxes. That is the answer. Anything else is not. I ask my colleagues on this committee to join us in building up the revenue of this nation, to provide for Social Security and Medicare benefits for all of our people, and to make sure that we do not use policies that are imbalanced and hurt some and lift up others. This is a nation of equality, justice, and respect for us all. With that in mind, let us help the hard-working Americans and find ways to promote their Social Security and security in their nation. That's what they do for us. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Texas, and now yield 3 minutes to a senior member on this budget committee. Man, I've learned a lot from Wisconsin, Glenn Grothman.
Well, first thing I'd like to point out is, a lot more gets done around here when you have all three. And we just got done with a biennium in which you guys had all three, which is fine. Things go back and forth. Ever since I've been involved in politics, I've been told how the problem with Social Security is we got to raise the limit on which we levy the tax. And you had all three, and I just think it's telling that when you had the opportunity to do that, you refused to do that. There are other things that I thought you were going to do on the revenue side. There was getting rid of a massive loophole in the estate tax that I just did get out. It did get out of this House, but that didn't survive, which kind of surprised me as well. But in any event, it's illuminating when you're in charge, you won't raise these taxes. Now, I will say this. The number one goal of that commission should be not to play with Social Security benefits, okay? There are people on my side who think, oh, we can go up to age 68, age 69. I'll tell you, it's pretty difficult for somebody who's 68 or 69-year-old to get a job today. And a lot of those people physically can't take those jobs. Other things some people like to do, they don't like to raise the age, they like to punish thrift. If somebody has a few $100,000 in their 401k, they say, well, he doesn't need the Social Security, we'll take that away. Or they like to punish work. Somebody's working when they're 72 or 73, they say, well, maybe we ought to change Social Security because that guy's working, he shouldn't get any. So those things should be off the table. Now, where will the money come from? You said all we can do is cut benefits or raise revenue. I disagree. There's not one more spending program that is more vital than Social Security. Like it or not, we have made a commitment to the public that these benefits will be there. And meanwhile, we continue to flood money at programs that are either wasteful or unconstitutional. I'm not going to say all these programs are bad, but they would be done more efficiently on a state level. I mean, we have a Department of Housing and Urban Development, a Department of Health, a Department of Education, Department of Labor. All these things should be taken away before we take one dime from Social Security. And that's not to say we shouldn't have any welfare programs, but if we have those programs, which, by the way, I think are designed primarily to keep the fathers out of their families, that seems to be the major goal of them. But if we're going to have those programs, if we are going to have programs designed to destroy the American family, at least they should be administered on a local level. Final comment, I will agree with one of my friends over there. He sounds like one of my heroes. We we do spend too much money on defense. I think sometimes those programs are designed because they're in some congressman's district or some business is politically active. And I'd be happy to work with you in the next round of appropriation bills to maybe eliminate some of that wasteful defense spending. We ought to get rid of the wasteful defense spending before we even look at Social Security. But in any event, stick with our Constitution, stick with the 10th Amendment, and get out of these programs that are meant to be administered on a local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grothman. We have only Republicans remaining. If we have some of our Democrat colleagues show up, we'll go back to alternating. Or do we have some? No, I think she passed.
Oh, she passed.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we are going to bring it home with the 3 or 4 remaining Republicans, starting with my friend from Kansas, who claims to have a larger production agriculture center, but I don't believe that's true, and I'd ask the American people to look very closely at that. Mr. Ron Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we can talk about agriculture protection later today, but we need to talk a lot about budget today. You know, more and more Kansans that I talk with are saying that the national debt's their top priority. As mentioned before, we've surpassed $34 trillion in debt at the beginning of this calendar year, and actually we're on target to be more than $36 trillion in debt by the end of this fiscal year. Every American's on the hook for $102,000. That's every man, woman, and child. Today, we're borrowing $1 out of $4 we spend at the federal level. Imagine if you were a family or a small business. You simply could not survive spending 25% of your spending being borrowed. And here's the sad truth. When we squabble over the spending on this committee or the House floor, it's over a drop in the bucket of the total spending by the federal government. Discretionary spending, spending that we actually vote on each year, only accounts for less than 30% of all government spending. The rest is automatic spending, set in place through various programs. In fact, discretionary spending is less than last year's deficit, so even if we set all of our appropriations to $0, which we could not or would not do, since that includes military and veterans and so many other high priority issues, we would still be borrowing just to cover the automatic spending we don't even get to vote on. This crisis didn't happen overnight. It's taken years to get to this point, but it seems that it's accelerating. This spending and debt increase has occurred over years, but the rapid acceleration is because of President Biden's outrageous spending is the largest deficit spending by any president in history outside of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's clear that the status quo in Washington is not working. We haven't passed all 12 appropriations bills on time since 1996, and both sides are to blame. We can't keep passing omnibus spending bills and continuing resolutions that do nothing to address our country's fiscal stability. A fiscal commission is one approach to correct course, and we're seeing here today there's bipartisan support to establish one. I know there are members on this committee who have attempted to address Washington's radical spending before. I've been a strong supporter of a balanced budget amendment, and even introduced an amendment to Congress last year to reduce non-defense spending by a mere 1%, just a small start to correct Washington's broken spending. It's encouraging that now there are a growing number of members who see this real threat to our nation and are ready to act. As we mark up these bills, I want to remind my colleagues that our detrimental spending habits today aren't just impacting the world we live in, but it's going to have deep impact on our kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. And it's the future generations that will bear the brunt of this body putting off making hard decisions. I urge my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to take today's discussion seriously because $34 trillion in debt is a sobering number, and we must correct course now. Passing these 3 bills is the right step in breaking Washington's bad spending habits. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, my friend from Kansas. I've said that I appreciated the leadership of Jimmy Panetta and Scott Peters. You were a founding member as well of this bipartisan fiscal forum, formerly 30 for 30. We would not be here without you, Ron. Thank you for your leadership, and let's go all the way, get this thing done, and do something meaningful for the American people while we're here in Congress. Again, thank you so much. Now let's yield 3 minutes to our friend from the Keystone State, Mr. Lloyd Smuckerford. Again, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're holding this hearing today. I've
testified in front of this committee about the need for a fiscal commission, as well as shared my experience with a commission in Pennsylvania that was bipartisan, bicameral, included the administration, and both a Republican and a Democrat administration. It spanned those administrations, and was perhaps one of the most effective legislative processes that I've been part of. So I believe in the importance of this commission, and I'd like to just very briefly go back to the basics of why I think this is important. Number one, I think we are facing an existential problem with our fiscal trajectory that we're on. 34 trillion in debt, 100% of our total economy, and projected to double over the next 30 years. At best, it will infringe upon the government's ability to provide any of its basic services, including Social Security and Medicare, which are both projected to run out if we do nothing. And at worst, there are many examples throughout history, both modern and over the past thousands of years, of countries and empires that have dominated the world for periods of time and then failed. And sometimes it can happen suddenly, and other times it's a decline over time. And often that decline or that collapse is a result of fiscal policies, of taking on too much debt, not being able to make good on that. And I'm concerned today, we're seeing a few months ago some softening in our treasuries market. And at the time when folks are no longer willing to buy U.S. treasuries, we're in real trouble. Second, number one is we have an existential problem we have to address. My second reason that I think we need a commission is because I think we can still solve big problems. I think Congress can solve big problems, and I think the American people are willing to step up and solve big problems. That's difficult to imagine sometimes in today's world with the chaos and the dysfunction that we're seeing here today, but we have to try. We have to try to solve this, and I believe if we engage the American people, we explain the problem we have, the American people will be willing to step up. They'll be willing to sacrifice. They'll be willing to do what is necessary to put us on a better path. And I think they will be willing to reward members of Congress who are willing to make the right decisions to put us on a better path. Again, it may be a tall order, but we've got to try. And I want to address just a few things that were brought up. People said, well, this is Congress's job. It's almost laughable when you see how long this has been a problem and it hasn't been addressed. We have to do something differently. We have to have real discussions about this problem. And I've heard a lot of positions being staked out here today, a lot of solutions. Folks said tax the wealthy, others said cut spending. Whatever that solution is, it means nothing if you can't convince 218 other members of Congress, 51 senators, and the president. And that's the problem. We do not have consensus about the best ways to move forward. We don't even have consensus about the problem. I feel at times in Ways and Means here in budget, the two parties are in two different worlds. So let's evaluate. Let's see if the wealthy are paying their fair share. Let's see if our spending is indeed increasing or decreasing, whatever it may be. Let's talk about real solutions moving forward. I see the role of a commission is to build that consensus. We don't have time in our regular committee order to do that. We each get 5 minutes. We can't really delve into the issues in a way that this problem requires. So I look forward to this commission. I look forward to it being used as a vehicle to find ways to work together and solve this massive problem that we all agree exists. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Spucker, especially for your valuable input throughout the process to get to where we are today. And now, Mr. Espaillat from New York. We yield to you, my friend, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Instead of focusing on currently introduced legislation that will help better Social Security and Medicare, these two vital programs that are really exemplify what America is about, we are focusing on a vehicle that bypasses democratic debate. Historically, fiscal commissions and super committees have failed to initiate legislative efforts to reduce the deficit. That's just a fact. Their traditional exclusive focus on deficits has led to proposals that will fast-track cuts to vital safety net programs. The intent here is not the deficit, it's to cut programs to the very neediest. Conversations to decrease the nation's deficit cannot be done at the expense of vulnerable populations that rely on and have contributed to programs like Social Security. In New York, for example, nearly 3.8 million residents rely on Medicare. We cannot place their health and economic stability at risk. Almost 112,000 residents in my district rely on Social Security. In the Washington Heights part of my district, a neighborhood that has 17% of the residents face food insecurity and 50% are rent burdened. I am concerned that a fiscal commission will not take this reality into consideration. As a member of the Budget Committee, I look forward to advancing legislation that meaningfully looks at the economic factors, including revenue. How do we reform the tax code to ensure that the very wealthy, the ones that try to avoid paying taxes, that now will benefit from having less enforcement in the IRS system to go after tax cheat, pay their fair share of taxes? Again, how can a nurse, a teacher, a police officer that puts his life out on the line, a firefighter that's heroic every day as she tries to save family, how should they pay more of a tax burden than the very rich? It's just inconsistent with America. And I think this effort to have a fiscal commission and a super committee does not take that into consideration. In fact, what it tries to do is hurt the neediest, impact programs that are life-saving for working-class Americans. The engine of our economy are working-class Americans, and not the extreme rich that every day get away with everything. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remaining part of my time.
I thank our colleague from New York, and now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from the Hoosier State, who is also the chair of our Budget Process Reform Initiative. Thank you for your efforts there, Mr. Rudy Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm thrilled to be here marking up these important pieces of legislation. The bills we are considering today are critical first steps in addressing our nation's enormous national debt. Just a few weeks ago, our debt passed $34 trillion, which is over $7 trillion, which includes over $7 trillion in intergovernmental debt. Overall, our national debt equates to $101,000 for every single American. In case those numbers weren't bad enough, last year we spent $659 billion on interest payments alone. That's a $84 billion increase from the previous year, and it's only expected to continue to rise in the years ahead. No one can look at these numbers and believe that our debt is sustainable or acceptable. It's essential that we take meaningful steps to address our debt and deficit, and we need to do it now. The Bipartisan Fiscal Commission Act of 2023, led by my colleagues, Representative Huizenga and my colleague, Representative Peters, has been thoughtfully designed and is a vital step in restoring fiscal responsibility to the federal government. I've been a strong supporter of setting up a fiscal commission that will make meaningful changes to how we spend tax dollars and rein in our entire debt, including our intergovernmental debt. I believe the Huizenga-Peters Act will do just that. The path we are on is not sustainable, and we need to stop pretending that it is. I'm also grateful to my colleagues Representative Smucker and Representative Golden for introducing the Debt to GDP Transparency and Stabilization Act, which is critical to monitoring our debt to GDP ratio and ensuring that it is included in the congressional budget resolution as well as the president's budget proposal. Additionally, I want to thank my colleagues Representative Moore, Peters, Barr, and Panetta for their leadership in the Fiscal State of the Nation Act. This bill will help foster greater awareness in Congress and in the American public on the fiscal health of our nation by requiring the Comptroller General to address a joint meeting of Congress on our current fiscal situation. Our debt and deficit should have been addressed a long time ago. The bills we are considering today represent an essential first step toward restoring fiscal sanity in our nation's capital. I want to thank Chairman Arrington for bringing these important bills to the committee for markup today. I encourage my colleagues to support, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana. A big part of restoring fiscal responsibilities to take our oversight jobs more seriously and to execute it more vigorously across the federal government, no matter who or what party is in power. I appreciate General Jack Bergman so much that I'm choking up just talking about it. I appreciate him stepping up and spending the extra time going above and beyond to lead that effort as our chair of Oversight Task Force. General Jack Bergman from Michigan, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By career, I'm a pilot. So allow me one quick flying analogy, because this experiment in self-governance is a little under 250 years old. So it took off with the ratification of the Constitution in the form of our government, back in 1788 or thereabouts. The point is, we've been in flight for a long time, and we refueled, aerial refueled a couple times to keep us going. We're in a descent right now. The question is it a landing or is it a crash? I would suggest to you, as I've listened here today, what's more challenging for us? Fear of change or fear of status quo? What is more dangerous when it comes to that, to our country, and by inference, to our children and to our grandchildren? And I've listened to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle make some very accurate statements. Some were not so accurate, potentially inflammatory, but welcome to Washington. We have both a spending and a revenue problem in our country. And until we can come to a realistic understanding about both sides of the ledger, we as a country will continue to edge closer to the fiscal abyss. And in an effort to save not only money but time, I'll just say I strongly support this commission for its intent. Now comes in the execution, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank my good friend from Michigan. And closing out the opening statements is our friend from the Palmetto State, Mr. Ralph Norman, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington. I'm honored to be here to mark these bills up and to form the Debt Commission. But one thing I've realized my short time in Congress is every dollar spent has got an advocate. And we're at the point now, as the General mentioned, I think we're there at the abyss. We're coming down. There is no way we can land this plane unless we get a handle on our spending and have actual cuts. The commission will be only as good as the courage we have up here to actually do some cuts. We say we can't tackle Social Security. Well, what are the options? Going broke? We say we can't tackle the Highway Trust Fund. What are the options? Going broke? And you can say 10 years, 12 years, 50, it doesn't matter. We're on a decline. Medicare, Medicaid, everything that's been said today, but what has gotten us in trouble in this great country that is a shining city on the hill for 250 years. I see the young people out here. I feel an obligation to do whatever it takes to get this, to get our budget under control. No business, no family budget can exist like the federal government in Washington, D.C. that has been fed by over so many years and has grown so burdensome to everybody. I would say crony capitalism has gotten us in trouble. You have companies funding candidates to do their bidding on your tax dollars. And folks, that's not sustainable. We have got to elect people that are unabashedly here for one reason alone, and that's for the survival of America. And unless we do, the outcome will not be good, and the runway is getting closer and closer. And I'm as, I guess, concerned over the last 2 years with what this administration is doing by allowing 8 to 15 million illegals coming into this country that are taking our schools. They have not contributed to our Social Security, not paying in on that. They don't speak the language. And never before have we had an open border. And if you relate to your individual business or home, would you take the locks off your home? Would you take the doors off your car? No, you don't do that. And that's exactly what's happened with this administration, all for the sake of power, all for the sake of registering 8 million people to vote and maintain the power. The status quo, we've got to stop. I'm committed with this commission to do whatever it takes. And one other thing I realized in being in Washington, we major in the minor. We pass all these meaningless resolutions that sound good, but it's time to do the work. There's no country that can survive what this country is facing today. And we've got to get priorities in place, which everybody has to do in the private sector. And we got the greatest country in the world, and to let it slide through our hands cannot be on my watch, it cannot be on our watch. And as one of 435 congressmen, there's 100 senators, I will do whatever I can to try to get this curse that is self-inflicted stopped. And Chairman Arrington, thank you for what you're doing to maintain some fiscal sanity in this country, and I look forward to working with you. I yield back.
I thank my friend from South Carolina. A point of privilege. There's a stalwart on this issue who has served in 2 administrations, Democrat and Republican, who has dedicated his private life now in sort of retirement, I don't know that you could call it retirement, to sounding the alarm, and has been a proponent of a commission for many years. Ran a campaign called Come Back America and 10 million a minute, which at the time in 2012 or whenever it was, we were spending 10 million a minute. We're millions more a minute spending today, but he hadn't given up. He's not given up on the country, and he's not given up on his grandchildren's future. Dave Walker, welcome to the chamber today, to our committee room. You're not a stranger to this group. And I think I can speak for the entire body here as a team, not as Republicans and Democrats. We appreciate your service to our country. With that, if there are any members who would like to submit a written statement for the record, I'll hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 5779. This legislation would establish a fiscal commission tasked with, among other things, identifying policies that will improve our nation's fiscal health. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection. So ordered. I have an amendment at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendment.
a manager's amendment offered by Chairman Arrington.
So now I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes to go over the chairman's or the manager's amendment. The manager's amendment incorporates the following changes to the bill introduced by my good friends, say that with all sincerity, Bill Huizinga from Michigan, who's on the Financial Services, also part of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, and Scott Peters of California. I will try to run through these quickly, but this we had a hearing with the Senate folks who have what I would call the companion bill, Joe Manchin, and who's the other gentleman? And Mitt Romney. How quickly we forget. They did a great job of presenting this bipartisan front on their framework for a fiscal commission. So trying to get this as reconciled between the two, I think will help us have a smoother takeoff and final vote. It includes the statement of goals for the commission, and we really emphasize the public awareness and education. We think at the end of the day, changing the, getting the American sentiment behind this in the sense of urgency will put the pressure and yield the political will ultimately for Congress to do its job. And so that's critical. We clarify that private sector members, which I think the consensus was having people outside of Congress on the commission will, leaders with credibility will validate both the problem and the solutions that we come up with, and that's going to be important. I think the American people, unfortunately, Mr. Higgins, have lost a lot of confidence in us. Now, what we do to compromise there is we say we want outside members on the commission. Each party in each chamber gets to appoint one, so there'll be 16 members, 4 of which are non-voting. So we do not give the voting card of elected members of Congress to these outside members. So I thought that was a good accommodation. The threshold, this was important. We talked about lessons learned from past commissions. Hey, I'm as skeptical as the next person about the success of commissions. But we made a intentional structural change to help us move to what we call expedited consideration on the floor of the House and Senate. We do that by saying, look, we get a simple majority with these 12 voting members of Congress, and you have at least 2 from each party so that it's bipartisan, it will go to the floor. If the will of the people through its elected representatives vote on it affirmatively, then we'll have ourselves a consensus strategy. We will satisfy the Fitch and Moody's concerns about a long and medium-term plan. So that's the threshold. It requires the commission to hold at least 6 public hearings, at least 6, including field hearings across the country. That will be exciting. And you could probably give us insight into that, Mr. Walker, since you completed, I think, 10,000 miles in a bus tour around the country. We'd be well served to do that in this commission, and I think that's the general gist. It authorizes the commission to meet, consider, and vote on an interim report before the end of this calendar, and then no later than May of 25 for a final report and set of recommendations. It clarifies federal agencies should provide technical assistance and consult as we consult with them, or the commission consults with them, rather. Hey, with that, Mr. Boyle, I recognize you for 5 minutes for any comments you want to make.
No, I'll waive at this point so that way we can get directly, obviously the managers, as going with precedent, not just in this committee, we adopt the manager's amendment with UC, and then that way we can get to the specific amendments that we have on this side of the aisle.
Thank you for that. Let's see here. We've got, without objection, the amendment in the nature of the substitute. Thank you, Mr. Boyle. The amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as base text for the purpose of amendment, so ordered. The amendments considered by the committee will be those submitted pursuant to the agreement I made with Ranking Member Mr. Boyle. The debate time for each amendment will be limited to 14 minutes, with time equally divided. The proponent of the amendment will have 6 minutes to open up, and then we will have a rebuttal for 7 minutes, and then the proponent of the amendment will have 1 minute to close. Are there any amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. We'll pause until we have that distribution.
Amendment number 1 on Social Security, offered by Ranking Member Boyle.
I think everybody has the text of the amendment. So with that, Mr. Boyle is recognized for 6 minutes.
All right, thank you. And this amendment could not be more in plain spoken. It is simply called Protect Social Security. This is an opportunity for all of us to make clear, regardless of which side of the aisle we sit on, that we recognize the importance of Social Security as the single greatest anti-poverty measure in American history. It is estimated that if Social Security did not exist, and let's not forget, it did not exist for the first 170 years or so of our nation's existence. If it did not exist today, about 40% of seniors in America today would live in poverty. Indeed, Social Security today represents the majority of income for millions of American retirees, the majority of their income. So when we talk about Social Security, I don't just look at it as, quote, some other government program. It is essential. It represents a sacred promise that this country and its government made to the American people. It is, to me, one of the greatest innovations in the history of our country. We should all band together and make clear, whether Democrats or Republicans, that we strongly support it. Now, everyone can read the amendment. It's only essentially 1 page. And let me clearly outline the goal or goals of the amendment. It states that the Fiscal Commission shall propose recommendations to strengthen and secure Social Security by 1, protecting Social Security benefits, and 2, extending Social Security solvency. This may include requiring taxpayers with incomes above $400,000 to contribute more to the Social Security Trust Fund, and paying for Social Security improvements by requiring the wealthiest Americans and corporations to pay their fair share. It has already been certified by a number of independent analysts, including the Joint Committee on Taxation, that the method that I just outlined would increase Social Security solvency, or extend it, I should say, by decades and decades. So we right now, in this simple 1-page amendment, can make clear where our values are, that we want to protect Social Security, and that we have a way to do so for many decades into the future. Because let's not forget, as I said before, Social Security is not just some government program, it's an earned benefit. People have paid into Social Security over a lifetime of work. Again, I think of my father, who's now well into his 70s, paid into Social Security for almost half a century of hard work, manual labor jobs. Social Security today represents the majority of his income in retirement. He is like tens of millions of Americans out there. the hardworking people of this country who built this country. We have to ensure that Social Security is there for decades to come. It has not missed a payment in the many decades, some 8 decades now, of its existence. We very simply, by this one measure, can ensure it'll be there for decades to come. So I hope that this can be an opportunity in which members on both sides of the aisle make clear where their values are, that they are committed to protecting Social Security. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Ranking member, is there a member who'd like to claim time in opposition to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I would.
Mr. Ferguson, you are recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me just say to my dear friend from Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you're kind of like a bird dog point, and you can't help yourself when it comes to going after weaponizing this, a bird dog pointing him. You're like a bird dog pointing. If you ask a bird dog not to point, he can't help himself. That's what he does. That's what you're doing on this. I said in my opening statements that we should not weaponize Social Security as a political topic. And so when we go down this road of saying that taxing people over $400,000 and making the wealthy pay their fair share is the way to fix Social Security, number one, is factually not correct. You cannot fix all of it by doing that way. Not saying we shouldn't take any option off of the table on this, but when we're telling this commission to make Social Security secure and solvent for the next 75 years, and then you're going to hamstring it right off the bat with these two points, is going against. It creates the environment where the commission simply cannot do its job. And I think we all agree that making sure that keeping our promise on Social Security to our America's seniors is very, very important. As a matter of fact, it's paramount. It's something that we are all going to do. But I think when you say this, I mean, just think about what's in this document. Folks paying over $400,000 to contribute more to the Social Security Trust Fund. Well, exactly how much does that outline? How much does that pay? What kind of revenue does it raise? It leaves us far short even in the first couple of years of solvency. That's number one. Number two, by having the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share, I would dare say right now that they paid the vast majority. I mean, you look at the amount of money that corporate America writes every single month as their part of the payroll taxes to the Social Security Trust Fund, paying a pretty fair share. And so this simply should be seen for exactly what it is. This is a political attempt to undermine the integrity of this commission, and simply this is an ad trying to write itself right here. And I just wish that we would be more intellectually honest in this discussion. Will Social Security, the fix for Social Security, require both modifications and revenue? The answer is probably yes. It probably is yes. But let's not hamstring this commission by telling it what it can and can't do before this horse even gets out of the gate. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would strongly recommend voting against this amendment. And I would also like to yield some time to my friend from Colorado, Mr. Moore.
I want to make sure that all
Utah.
I want to make sure all the Utah representatives know I come from the state where we are named the greatest snow on earth, and Colorado is a distant second to our ski industry. So
my apologies from a Georgia guy that doesn't know really what snow
of all the
looks
states to confuse me with, Colorado's a tough one, but we get the Olympics coming back, so we're good. We win that one. We win that battle. Look, I just want to continue on with the point. Like, we cannot hamstring the commit. The whole point of today was to establish a commission that, remember, in order for this to pass, it has to garner broad support in Congress, right? In the Senate and the House. We have set up the structure to be able to set us up for success. And we can't dictate the outcomes. So this is entirely about setting up a process, setting up a commission to help us accomplish a goal. But we can't tell the commission what the goal is. We can't hamstring and tell them the outcome. That's actually makes today entirely pointless. So I echo my colleague from Georgia's notion that this becomes very politically difficult and actually disingenuous to some degree about who all uses it to go after the other side. We have to rise above that. This is none of this is an easy piece. When we had our hearing about this a few months ago, I made the point over and over again. This is difficult for everybody. This is not. But that's what we're elected to do, and we have to be willing to address this. So let's not dictate the outcomes. Let's give the commission that will be set up in a very sound, bipartisan manner to be able to go after this issue and look at data and be able to determine what the next 10 years looks like. I can't overemphasize the point. If we can't even address and we just can't touch one of our nation's largest expenditures, like we can't go after the issue. We limit ourselves to being able to solve any of these problems. And so this commission is set up in the proper way. Let's not add more things to it to cumber its ability to be successful. And I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Utah now recognizes Mr. Boyle for 1 minute. We yield the rest of the time.
Well, first, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentleman from Georgia for the compliment. Bird dog, was that it? He is right. I am the bird dog for saving and protecting Social Security. I am that committed to saving this program that I have co-authored, along with Sheldon Whitehouse, legislation very similar to what's outlined in this amendment that would extend the solvency of Social Security through the year 2100. Perhaps the gentleman, and he mentioned the term intellectual dishonesty. I'm disappointed in him using that language. He may disagree with my approach, but there's nothing dishonest about it. Perhaps he's unaware that the Joint Committee on Taxation, as well as others, have verified that taking this exact approach would extend the solvency of Social Security for decades. What I see as intellectual dishonesty is among those who frankly are open to cutting Social Security, but don't want to come out and say it. That's where the intellectual dishonesty lies. Now, someone might disagree, and I'm already over time. Someone might disagree with my approach when it comes to doing this on revenues. Then just be upfront and say it, that you would prefer a cuts-only or a mixed approach. I do not. That's why I'm offering this amendment. And yes, I am proud to be the bird dog for Social Security. I yield back.
I see a new rebranding in your future, Mr. Boyle. Thank you for that comment. And one thing's for sure, Republicans have had the supermajority, Democrats have had the supermajority. Neither has addressed Social Security, neither. With all the ideas and all the preferences for the mix of strategies, just hadn't happened. So I hope we can get there in a sensible manner, putting our seniors first. Now I'm asking the same question. Once again, are there any other amendments? No, I've got to actually say a few other words. Question on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Boyle. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, ask for a recorded vote.
Roll call vote is requested pursuant to the bipartisan agreement. We will postpone the roll call votes until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Ms. Jackson Lee, the clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of that amendment. We'll pause for a minute or two, and then I'll yield to Ms. Jackson Lee 6 minutes.
Amendment number 2 on Medicare offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
Ms. Jackson Lee, you're recognized for 6 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I have an amendment at the desk as indicated. My amendment would ensure that the Fiscal Commission makes specific recommendations to strengthen and secure Medicare by protecting the traditional Medicare program and extending Medicare solvency. For example, by requiring taxpayers with incomes above $400,000 to contribute more to Medicare, and closing a tax loophole that allows wealthy owners of pass-through businesses with more than $400,000 in annual income to avoid Medicare taxes. Who can imagine? And so I thank you for the opportunity to briefly explain my amendment and the reasons why I'm offering it today. Chairman Arrington, Democrats are ready and willing to find bipartisan solutions to America's fiscal challenges. We too want a solvent nation, but I will never support any legislation or initiative that would put the likelihood and livelihood of American families at risk. The very same person that our chairman, Mr. Boyle, spoke about, his father. It is unacceptable that the chairman's mark does not require the Fiscal Commission to protect Medicare from steep benefit cuts. Medicare has been, for some, the only medical lifeline that they have had. It is shown over the decades that Medicare has saved lives, that people actually died before Medicare was implemented. I hope we can work together to find bipartisan solutions to address Medicare solvency while protecting health security for 64 million seniors and persons with disabilities. However, we already know that congressional Republicans' track record on this looks like. For years, Republican members of Congress have repeatedly tried to cut Medicare benefits and move toward privatization. On the other hand, congressional Democrats and President Biden today have introduced proposals to strengthen Medicare and extend its solvency. We extend our hand of friendship to work with Republicans to do the same. For example, the President's 2024 budget strengthens Medicare for another generation by extending the solvency of the Hospital Insurance Fund, Trust Fund, by at least 25 years without cutting benefits or raising the retirement age, ensuring millions of Americans can count on Medicare to be there for them. We must make sure the Fiscal Commission's recommendations protect Medicare benefits for our seniors and persons with disabilities. We cannot, without concern, pass legislation that does not protect them. The Jackson Lee Amendment to H.R. 5779, the Fiscal Commission, for these reasons, namely, to ensure proper protections and considerations are in place for securing critical federal programs for aging and vulnerable people in America, I am offering the Jackson Lee Amendment to H.R. 5779, the Fiscal Commission Act. Specifically, the Jackson Lee Amendment states the following: the Fiscal Commission shall propose recommendations to strengthen and secure Medicare by protecting the traditional Medicare program and extending Medicare solvency, which may include requiring taxpayers with incomes above $400,000 to contribute more to Medicare, and B, closing a tax loophole that allows wealthy owners of pass-through businesses with more than $400,000 in annual income to avoid Medicare taxes. It is important that this body adopt my amendment to require that appropriate and necessary protections are put in place to protect aging and vulnerable populations who rely on these critical government programs. Knock on doors in your district. We all do that. And I will assure you that you will find, maybe every other door, you will find a Medicare recipient, and that is their health care lifeline. Democrats are ready and willing to find bipartisan solutions to America's fiscal challenges, but we will not endanger the lives of American families so that Republicans can pass more tax cuts for billion-dollar corporations and the ultra-rich. It is important that this body adopt my amendment to require that appropriate and necessary protections are put in place, again, to protect aging and vulnerable populations who rely on these critical government programs. There's no shame in this because all of these people have worked every day of their life in life-giving occupations, in the mines, on the railroads, driving trucks, teachers, nurses, and others to help America. We can at least help them, and we cannot undermine their safety net. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee Amendment, reserve.
I thank the gentlelady for her amendment and her remarks, and now ask if there are any members who would like to claim time in opposition to the amendment. Mr. Carter from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recognized, speak in opposition.
I yield 7 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia.
You know, Mr. Chairman, if we were going to name this particular commission, it'd probably be the 5S Commission. Because what we're trying to do is trying to secure, stabilize, and strengthen Social Security. Nobody's talking about cuts. Nobody's talking about raising taxes. What we're talking about is securing, stabilizing, and strengthening a vital program. That's what we're talking about. Generations of Americans have paid into this. They paid into Medicare, and they've come to rely on the Medicare's promise of health security, making it critical that we protect and strengthen the program. I know this. For a fact, I'm a healthcare professional. I've serviced patients, Medicare recipients. I know they depend on this. I know how important it is to them. I recognize that. That's why I'm not saying cut, raise taxes. That's why I'm saying secure, stabilize, and strengthen Social Security. This commission does not make a single cut to Medicare benefits for our seniors. Not a single cut, not one. The duties of the commission are outlined in the bill text. They call to improve the solvency of federal programs for which a trust fund exists for a period of at least 75 years. Imagine, just imagine, we could be the Congress that does that. We could secure, we could stabilize, we could strengthen Social Security. Not only could we do that, we need to do that. People are depending on us. But we've got to do it in a bipartisan fashion. It cannot be done in a partisan fashion. That's all there is to it. It's got to be done in a bipartisan fashion. Today's seniors depend on it. We know that. Those who are nearing retirement depend on it. And they plan on it. And future generations of Americans deserve it. Providing the commission with a specific policy solution that has been suggested here and proposed here would limit the ability to review the needs of this program and others in the broader context. And that, Mr. Chairman, is why I oppose this. And I urge a no vote on this amendment. And I'll yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Thank Mr. Carter for yielding. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Jackson Lee for the sentiment to protect Medicare and the previous amendment to protect Social Security as well. I think we all want to ensure that we can keep the promises that have been made to those who are relying and who need these programs, who have paid into the system. And we also know that if nothing is done, if this commission or some other vehicle is not used to make changes, we won't be able to keep those promises. So I appreciate the goal of this amendment. But I also want to go back to something I mentioned earlier, and that is that we all have different ideas about how to address the fiscal trajectory that we're on, how we can fix it, how we can ensure that Social Security and Medicare promises can be kept. And that's the purpose of the commission itself, to evaluate these issues and then to come up with a shared understanding of the issues and then potential solutions that it would recommend to Congress. could very well decide to do things along the line of this amendment. But I think it's really, really important that we don't take anything off the table in terms of what the commission will be looking at. Again, could arrive at conclusions that I agree with, that you agree with, or we'll find something in the middle. But I think the goal is to create a framework that allows everything to be on the table, as our chairman said, so that our path forward can be evaluated in the best context, the fullest context possible. So for that reason, I think while this amendment is well-intentioned, I think it would hinder and hamper the commission's ability to be effective and to come up with effective solutions. And so for that reason, I oppose the amendment as well. And I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Before I yield the closing comments to our colleague from Texas, when I think about, I'm sorry the clock ran out up there, I was going to take the remainder of that time, but it won't take me long, just to make a point. And I just associate myself with the tone and the comments of my colleagues that we don't want to predetermine the outcome here. And I believe this. I think the intention of each and every member and of this commission is strengthen, save, stabilize, and we know seniors are counting. My mom and dad are counting on it. And but that doesn't mean, for example, there's a but let me give you an example of a savings as opposed to a revenue opportunity. A non-beneficiary savings opportunity is something that President Obama put in his budget that we included in our budget resolution. And it's what is referred to as site neutrality. And what's happened is we're paying hospitals a premium to provide the same outpatient service that independent physicians provide. It's actually creating a perverse incentive that is consolidating independent practices into hospitals because they can make more money. It's hard to compete with hospitals when our reimbursement is more to them. And so in many cases now, because hospitals have gobbled up a lot of these independent practices, simply can't compete, they're using the same physicians and healthcare providers doing the same procedures with the same outcomes, but they're getting paid inordinately more, and there's all kinds of studies. It is a lot of money that if we were running this as stewards of taxpayers, we would not allow this practice to continue. Now, I got an earful for some of my hospitals back home, and I recognize they have a tough job, and we should talk about how we make sure they're viable as a stakeholder in the healthcare ecosystem. But that isn't a best practice. That isn't effective and efficient stewardship. So that's just one bipartisan opportunity. And by the way, if we move to site neutrality, we would save $120 billion over the 10-year window. Bipartisan, introduced first by a Democrat president, now adopted into our resolution, just one example. So with that, close us out, my dear friend from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you. Before I do so, I want to make sure the ranking member doesn't have a brief word on this amendment, and I will close after him with a brief word.
Ms. Jackson Lee is a much better public speaker than I am, so I wouldn't dream of taking any time for her 1 minute. So please don't count this against her. Thank you.
Let me thank you, and thank you to the chairman as well. But this is a simple amendment that provides the girding that we don't undermine those Americans who desperately are in need of Social Security and its protection. We know what America was like pre-Medicare, pre-Social Security. There were no lifelines, and Americans were dying at 40 and 50 years old. They worked hard for 20 years, their body broke down, they had no resources to live in their older years. We must be challenged to never go back to that route again. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment that reinforces and girds Medicare as we do the research that we believe will get us at another point. I don't want to see us go down the pathway of seniors not having and ill persons not having a lifeline. I ask for the Jackson Lee amendment to be supported. With that, I yield.
I thank my colleague for her intention and sentiments on this. The question now on agreeing to the amendment is offered by Ms. Jackson Lee. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those in opposition, no. No. It's the opinion of the chair that noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
So a roll call vote is requested pursuant to the bipartisan agreement. We will postpone the roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other? Yes, ma'am.
The President's budget extending Medicare solvency by 25 years or more, strengthening Medicare and lowering healthcare costs. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Are there any other amendments? Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer an amendment. This amendment requires the Fiscal Commission to include revenue increases that asks the wealthy and corporations to pay their fair share. If this measure were enacted, it could mean considering an increase in the corporate tax rate, imposing a minimum tax on billionaires as they pay at least 25% of their full income.
Mr. Higgins, if I could ask you just to suspend your remarks until I ask the clerk to designate the amendment and distribute copies of that amendment. We'll come back and we'll restore your full time, your full first 6 minutes, and then you'll have the 1 minute rebuttal. Bless you. Clerk, designate the amendment. Let's distribute, take a minute or so, and we'll commence.
Amendment number 3 on taxes offered by Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Chairman, while we have this moment, if you don't mind, I just wanted to recognize a special guest,
Well,
our
you
former
bet.
colleague, John Yarmouth from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Great to have you back in the room.
One day he'll be looming large behind us. Is he already looming large behind us somewhere? No, that will happen. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's going to be hard to compete with that portrait. You were at Chairman Womack's portrait hanging and loved your remarks, which you could tell stem from a sincere and deep friendship over the years. And so way to set the tone and lead by example. I'm still working on Brendan Boyle, but I think we're going to get there eventually. Okay, now the distribution of the amendment has commenced, and we will continue with Mr. Higgins' remarks of full 6 minutes. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer an amendment. The amendment requires the Fiscal Commission to include revenue increases that ask the wealthy and corporations to pay their fair share. If this measure were enacted, it could mean considering tax increase in the corporate tax rate, imposing a minimum tax on billionaires so that they pay at least 25% on their full income, or closing the loophole for Wall Street fund managers to carried interest as ordinary income. While the chairman's mark does require the Fiscal Commission to consider revenues, it does not require the commission to consider tax increases that ask the wealthy and corporations to pay their fair share. Years of tax cuts for the very wealthy have reduced the amount of revenues that the federal government collects. The Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, in sum, have added $10 trillion to the national debt. Without these tax cuts, our federal debt would remain at a sustainable level forever. The Fiscal Commission must recommend policies that ask the wealthy to pay their fair share and increase revenues. I hope that we can find bipartisan solutions or increasing revenues on the wealthy, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
I thank the gentleman from New York. Is there a member who'd like to claim time in opposition to the amendment?
Chairman.
Mr. Blakemore of Utah.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'll just, I rise in opposition to this amendment. Like, our nation already has one of the most progressive tax codes of developed nations, with higher income people paying high tax rates. We know that. We've all seen the scale. We all, can evaluate that on an individual basis. According to the Tax Foundation, in 2021, The top 1%, we always talk about the 1%, the top 1% pay 40% of all income taxes. We could talk at this ad nauseum, and we have. And that's not what we're here to do today. Our goal today is to not debate tax rates. The sponsor of this bill, the gentleman from New York, and I are on the same committee, the Tax Writing Committee of Ways and Means. That's where we have these debates. The debate today is, can we sincerely look at where we are in a political reality situation, right? When one party has the White House, House, and Senate, they charge forward with their big initiatives. In 2017, a bill I would have been supportive of, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the Republicans did that, right? I've been critical that we didn't do enough about spending at the same time when we had that political reality at that time. And I'm okay being on the record for that. And then in 2021, and I've been here 3 years, right? So I've been in the minority and the majority. And in 2021, I saw the Democratic Party having the White House, House, and Senate, and they charged forward with American Rescue Plan and Inflation Reduction Act. They're big priorities, right? And neither situations has gotten after our deficit issue. We have a moment here, like was just previously mentioned, to be the 118th Congress that actually does something to address this. Okay? And we're gonna do that by setting up a structure that puts us forward with the best chance for success. This amendment is trying to, again, dictate an outcome. And we're not trying to do that with this commission. We are trying to empower this process to create the best outcomes. We've talked about times in our past where whether we established Social Security or Medicare, or when we've reformed in '84, there was work that was done, sincere work from Reagan and O'Neill. Can we be that group? Our political reality right now is we're in split government. So we have a filibuster in the Senate that has to pass on bipartisan support. The House of Representatives can either continue to do nothing and wait for a potential massive cut to Social Security in 8 to 10 years, or we can actually address something. And that's what we're trying to do here. So this isn't to dictate tax rates. This isn't to say what income group is supposed to pay what. We're supposed to empower this commission, not dictate outcomes, and look at what ultimately comes out of this as a final product, and then we all get to decide whether we can vote for it or not. And I just want to encourage us to stay on point, not dictate outcomes, and set up this commission and do something for the American people. And I would like to yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Burkeen.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Chairman's indulgence. Thank you. Thank you to my colleague from Utah. I'm curious, how many of us, if you've ever gone to a general practitioner and they knew that they needed to send you to a specialist, the general practitioner wrote a prescription and said the specialist can do everything except X, Y, and Z. It's really what we're doing here. And so if we set up a commission asking them to specialize and look at different options, and the general practitioner sets the confinement restricting an option, is it really wise? So I encourage my members to vote no on this. And I can't help, as a farm kid, for those of you, if you've ever tried to pour hydraulic fluid in a tractor with a 5-gallon bucket, especially on a cold morning, you have to match the funnel with that 5-gallon bucket that weighs, especially when you're younger, it outweighs you by multitudes. And another way of putting this in word picture is you don't put a funnel for a lawnmower in the back of a tractor you're trying to pour high viscosity fluid into. And so to restrict what is already going to be a heavy lift even further, it just is not common sense. With that, I yield.
I couldn't add anything to that. I appreciate those comments from my colleagues, and I associate myself with them. Are there any other members that would like to make comments in opposition to the amendment?
Well, gentlemen, yield.
Yes, yield to Mr. Peters.
I just want 30 seconds to say I agree with the policy positions of Mr. Boyle, Ms. Jackson-Lee, Ms. Higgins, and Mr. Scott on his amendment. I think that they should be, I just don't think this is the forum, this is the right place to assert them. They should be part of the discussion. If we don't come out, if we don't deal with these issues in a satisfactory way, Democrats should not let the proposal come to the floor. If it comes to the floor and these things are not handled in terms of revenues, and protecting benefits, I will reserve the right to vote no, and I would vote no. So I just think that it's not part of the charter of the commission itself. It's part of the content of the discussion, and I hope that we can get that discussion started as soon as possible.
I think the gentleman from California, and again, I agree, I think there are legitimate considerations that have been voiced. There are probably a number of more considerations, a plethora of strategies to achieve a reduction in deficit and lower debt to GDP, more stabilized indebtedness. We can't micromanage this debt commission. It flies in the face of the very mission, is to get thoughtful members. As we said, and I committed to, we put all things on the table for debate and consideration. And then let's figure out if we have, the leadership skill to fashion something that can get that 218 or 216 now and dwindling on the floor of the House and with the votes required in the Senate. But I understand the intention, and I appreciate the passion. It's not the first time I've heard that as a fellow Ways and Means member. So with that,
Gentlemen, yield
yes,
just
absolutely.
for, I would say I hear the points made on essentially, I'm characterizing this attempting to keep the commission clean.
Yeah.
But this is not an attempt to, quote, micromanage things. It's not as if we offered 100 amendments. I think having a few, which are here, guardrails on this commission would be appropriate, which is why folks on this side of the aisle, myself included, have offered these amendments.
And
Thank you.
I appreciate
Yield
that. I just want my colleagues to understand that my Republican colleagues, many of whom are skeptical, and we're trying to build support for this, would like for us to have a no tax clause in this. And I would be I would have a more favorable view from my caucus if I would include such a provision. But I know it would kill any opportunity for us to get around the table and see if we can strike a common sense a deal that probably both sides will have concerns with, but just may save our country. So I appreciate what you're saying. I just think there are lots of ideas and considerations. The key is give maximum discretion and flexibility to come up with and to find that sweet spot of consensus that can get us that threshold of action on the floors of both chambers.
Mr. Chairman,
yes,
if I could, a brief word
Yes.
on this.
Yield.
To echo your sentiment, look, we want this commission to have every bit of leeway and opportunity that it can to operate. And I think if we go down the road of offering all of these amendments, we're gonna start pushing each other's buttons, and then we're gonna start saying, well, we can't do anything unless we do work requirements for entitlements. We can't, whatever the issue is that just spins the other side up. I just think that honestly, keeping this thing as clean as possible, giving maximum flexibility, realizing that it probably leads to a very honest conversation of where we have to go. I'd rather have this commission have total clarity on that without restrictions. Yield back, sir.
And one last comment from the peanut gallery. My ranking member could have loaded the barrel with infinite number of amendments. I mean, an infinite number. But he chose to focus on a few that were most important to his colleagues, and I appreciate that. I really do. And again, I think a lot of them certainly have merit for consideration and debate, and I believe and I'm committed to having all of those mentioned and unmentioned on the table for consideration. So thanks for that willingness to work. Close us out, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've stated explicitly several times that everything should be on the table. And when you look at a fiscal commission, regardless of what our opinions about whether it's a spending problem or a revenue problem, both have to be considered. The federal government is 23% of the American economy. And we have a problem, as expressed by both Republicans and Democrats, that up to $500 million to $1 trillion is avoided each and every year because of tax cheats or avoidance. So obviously, for the commission to have integrity, everything should be on the table, including all revenue potential and also spending. So with that, I'll yield back.
I thank my friend from New York. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Higgins. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. The opposition, or the opinion rather, of the chair is that the noes have it.
We'd ask a recorded vote.
A roll call vote is requested. Pursuant to the bipartisan agreement, we'll postpone the roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there other amendments? Mr. Scott.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. If we can just suspend for a brief moment, then I will hand the mic back to you for your first 6 minutes of remarks.
Amendment number 4 on the tax gap offered by Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott from Virginia is recognized for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment requires the Fiscal Commission to include recommendations that would close the tax gap. That's the difference between what's owed and what's actually collected. This may include increased funding for the Internal Revenue Service to enforce existing law on wealthy taxpayers, such as those making over $400,000 a year who are out of compliance. There are a lot of reasons for this amendment. The first is that the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute does not require the Fiscal Commission to close the tax gap as part of a solution to reducing the national debt. According to the Department of Treasury, the IRS has collected an additional $520 million in tax revenue already as a direct result of the recent crackdown on evasion by 1,600 taxpayers who have over $1 million in income and had over $250,000 in recognized tax debt. This is about allowing the IRS to enforce current law and make sure the wealthy are not evading their taxes. We can't seriously consider our fiscal situation without making sure that all taxpayers are fairly paying what they owe. Today's tax code consists of 2 sets of rules, one for regular wage and salary workers who have virtually all of their income reported to the IRS and have their taxes withheld, another for wealthy taxpayers who are able to avoid a large share of their taxes by underreporting. Closing the tax gap would eliminate a major source of inequity. The IRS estimates that it is currently not able to collect about 15% of the taxes that are owed because of understaffing that's gone on for decades, making it harder to enforce laws that are already on the books. As a direct result of the tax gap, or the difference between how much is owed and how much is collected, they estimate that around $600 billion a year, or $7 trillion, is lost over a decade. This equates to about 3% of the GDP, or all income taxes paid by the lowest 90% of taxpayers. And most of this evasion comes from the wealthiest taxpayers, with the top 1% of income alone making up about a quarter of all evaded revenue. IRS estimates that if we just spent all of the $80 billion IRS received for enforcement for high-income payers as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, we could reduce the deficit by over $100 billion, maybe as much as $500 billion over the next decade. But unfortunately, much of this funding has been rescinded, and so we won't get that benefit. And this amendment just highlights the difference between talking about the problem and doing something about it because we are currently considering a commission to talk about the reducing the deficit, while the Republican House majority is insisting on cuts to the IRS, which would have the effect of increasing the tax gap, making the deficit even worse. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield the balance of the time.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Yeah. I want to enter into the record, and thank you, Mr. Scott. I want to enter into the record this fact sheet from the Department of Treasury, dated just 6 days ago, January 12th. It outlines that thanks to the resources provided to it by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS has now collected $482 million in an ongoing effort to recoup taxes owed by just 1,600 millionaires. So this is exactly what you, Mr. Scott, were talking about in terms of the tax gap and the need for tax enforcement. Frankly, this should offend all Americans when the wealthiest 1%, or a subset of the wealthiest 1%, don't pay the taxes they owe. De facto, it means the rest of us end up having to pay more. So this is the greatest evidence that can be provided for the need for Mr. Scott's amendment. And thank goodness the IRS now has these resources, which only will help all of us. $482 million, and that's not coming from increasing taxes on anyone. So without objection, I ask this be submitted to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I yield the balance of the time to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you very much. No matter your opinion on raising revenues, I would hope that all of us can agree that people should pay taxes they already owe. And I appreciate the ranking member's information. Chronic underinvestment in the Internal Revenue Service has left the United States with a widening gap between taxes owed and taxes paid. The latest estimate, as he said, nearly $500 billion a year. Sadly, the wealthiest Americans are those with the largest amount of tax evasion. There's no polite way to say it. The top 1% fail to pay $163 billion a year, 28% of all unpaid taxes. This amendment simply directs the Fiscal Commission to prioritize solutions that ensure people pay the taxes they owe. Every dollar available for auditing taxpayers generates many, many times that amount for the federal government. But by rescinding billions of dollars in enforcement, the IRS will be less able to enforce against taxpayers with more complex returns. This is simply tax justice. This is not low-hanging fruit. It's picking the fruit up off the ground. And we're all better off if people obey the law. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Oregon and my friend from Virginia for the amendment, and now would ask if there are any members who would like to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chuck Edwards. We yield to you 7 minutes.
All right, I don't think I'll need 7 minutes to address this. I heard a member a while ago suggest that maybe we ought to put guardrails on what this commission should do. I believe this amendment goes well beyond that and tends to send it down a particular rabbit hole. The reality is that America has long had one of the most progressive tax codes among developed nations, with higher income people paying higher taxes. According to the Tax Foundation, in 2021, the top 1% pay 40% of all income taxes. I think that number should soak into everyone here. The top 1% pay 40% of all income taxes. And under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, lower income Americans received a larger tax cut than higher income Americans. A Heritage Foundation analysis details that the percentage decrease in effective tax rates was about 5% for the highest income group and 16% for half the Americans whose income is below the median.
And we're suggesting that this commission should go out and attack or tackle really so many different taxpayers. While we all agree every taxpayer should pay their fair share, it's very difficult for anyone in this room to specify what that fair share should be. And in addition, following the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, federal revenues actually increased to record levels. The key to this commission's ability to succeed is going to be its flexibility, rather than preempting their work now with specific policy outcomes, which is an obvious theme from many of the amendments that we've seen in the last few minutes. Our role today is to pass a framework that will allow the commission to succeed. This work must be bipartisan, as referenced many times here this afternoon, in the broader context. I would urge a no vote on this amendment. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Ferguson.
Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, and thank the gentleman from North Carolina. Look, we have gone down this road of debating whether these enforcement numbers are meaningful or if they're gimmicky. But there are a couple of things I want to point out here. We've heard that, and I think the article, and I would ask the ranking member to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the article that you submitted for the record just a few minutes ago, we're talking about the billions of dollars supplied to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act that has helped us collect over $520 million. Is that?
To be fair, the IRS, it's a fact sheet from the IRS, although a lot of articles have been written on it. It's $482 million.
Okay, and how much did we spend to get $482 million?
Well, as the gentleman might be aware, because we both served on Ways and Means at the time, I believe the return on investment from those dollars, keep in mind, this is just the beginning of this effort.
Right, but I'm asking how much did we spend to collect 400?
On the IRS enforcement, I mean, it was into the billions. I can't recall the exact number,
all right.
although some of it has since been agreed to be rescinded as well.
Exactly, and and again, the president signed into law in the Fiscal Responsibility Act and agreed to rescind.
A portion is rescinded.
1.4 billion. I just think we need to look at this and see actually how well this is working or not working, and realize that we have all sorts of problems within the IRS. Give you one example right now. The IRS has issued a new program that allows people that did not pay their taxes during, I think it's years 2020 and 2021 due to COVID. They are now allowing them to waive, if they pay by April, that they get to waive any penalties or fees. That doesn't seem fair to those of us that paid our taxes on time. If money were such a real issue for the IRS, why in the heck are they waiving penalties and fees on people that didn't pay their taxes? I think that's before we go give them more money, let's make sure they use the money that they've got very well. They continue to be way behind the curve in the implementation of their IT budget, making sure that they are securing taxpayer information, and also making sure that they efficiently run their existing systems. The answer can always not be we need more money and more people. We've got to do better with the resources that we've got. So, again, the basic premise here is I don't think we ought to put restrictions on this commission. That's the ultimate pushback against these amendments, but also continuing to fund an agency that has shown that it has really not done a good job with the resources that it's been given, I just don't think is a wise move. So with that, I'd urge a no vote on this, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Does anyone else want to speak in opposition? I recognize Mr. Panetta for the balance of our time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In opposition.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I am in opposition of this amendment as well as the other three, not because I'm against the purpose of the policies that they're putting forward. I want to protect Social Security. I want to protect Medicare. I want to make sure that we have proper revenue in order to balance our budget. And yes, of course, ideally, we want to close our tax gap through making sure that everybody pays their taxes and that we go after tax cheats. However, I do believe that these types of amendments for the Fiscal Commission are against the spirit of the Fiscal Commission and what we want to do to make sure that everything is on the table to have fruitful, beneficial, collaborative discussions going forward. So that is why I'm against the amendments.
I thank the gentleman from California, and that concludes the opposition remarks. With the closing comments, Mr. Scott from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this again just speaks to the difference between talking about it and doing something. If we were to spend a little more money making sure that we're collecting what's owed, we could help reduce the deficit. The Republicans are reducing that effort. And there's a difference between the Republican and Democratic approach to the budget. When we did Medicare Part D, prescriptive drug benefit, under the Republicans, it wasn't paid for, just passed it. Deficit spending. When the Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act, there were taxes to pay for it. So when the vote was taken, if you wanted the Affordable Care Act, you had to agree to the taxes. If you don't want to agree to the taxes, you didn't get the Affordable Care Act. A commission will not cure that. And that's why we need to stop talking about it and get serious about the budget. And I would hope that this amendment would be one that we would adopt to get us in that direction. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. The question's on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Scott. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. Pursuant to the agreement that I have reached with Ranking Member Boyle, we will complete consideration of H.R. 57. Well, we skipped it. Guys, on these little, back and forth here, I'm reading a script, which I hate to do. Wish I could memorize Robert's Rules of Order here, but we need to, the noes have it, in my opinion, and pursuant to our agreement, we'll take that roll call vote at the end of our markup. With that, pursuant to the agreement I have with Mr. Boyle, we will complete consideration of 5779 later in the markup, and the committee will proceed to consideration of H.R. 6952, another bipartisan process reform bill, the fiscal state of the nation, led by our colleagues on the Budget Committee. Leading off this effort is Blake Moore from Utah, Scott Peters, Jimmy Panetta, both from California. This bill will help us sound the alarm and raise the awareness to the American people, not just how big the problem is, how exponentially worse it's getting, and the potential catastrophic effects of not dealing with it. I think it actually takes some of the political theater and propaganda out of a State of the Union, by the way, both parties, presidents from both parties, and have a more substantive and important understanding of the fiscal state and the fiscal health that is of this country that is in rapid decline. I think when you do that, I think we'll have more conversations around the country, more ideas, and more accountability on Congress to do something about it. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with, and that the bill will be considered as read and open amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendment be dispensed with without objection, so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement I've reached with Ranking Member Boyle, there'll be up to 10 minutes of debate on H.R. 6957. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Moore from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Boyle, for giving us this opportunity and for including H.R. 6952, the Fiscal State of the Nation
Would the
Act.
gentleman suspend? I've got to get the numbers right here, so.
Yeah, understood.
Thank you for correcting. That's 6952, H.R. 6952, the Fiscal State of the Nation Act, and I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Utah. Thank you.
And the next bill will be H.R. 6957, by Mr. Schmucker, which is also a very good bill. I look forward to hearing from that. Again, just thank you so much for including HR 6952 with fiscal state of the nation into today's hearing and markup. I was pleased to introduce this bipartisan legislation alongside my colleagues, Congressman Scott Peters, Andy Barr, and Jimmy Panetta. This legislation would require Congress to hold an annual joint meeting to receive a presentation from the Comptroller General on the fiscal condition of the United States. The bill requires that the Government Accountability Office presentation be conducted in an objective, nonpartisan, and accessible manner, and that it be open to the public and in addition to other members. Additionally, each concurrent resolution of the budget would be required to include findings on the fiscal state of the nation. As we've discussed already today, our country must get its fiscal house in order. Members of Congress and the public alike should know the fiscal status of our trust funds and understand the realities of our spending habits. When Congress doesn't budget appropriately, we crowd out opportunities to invest in our future and ensure we have a strong national defense. Ultimately, we cannot reduce our spending effectively if we don't know what opportunities there are for members of Congress to work together on a bipartisan basis to bolster oversight, reduce waste, and streamline federal programs. I believe the Fiscal State of the Nation Act will enhance transparency of federal spending and our long-term fiscal outlook, and I urge my colleagues to support its passage. This bill has had a place in previous Congresses. I truly believe that, you know, with the folks that we have on this and the moment in our nation, that this is the time to get this bill done. Every American that would guess, well, why aren't you already doing this? Like, this is something that makes sense. It adds transparency, and I look forward to driving this to the finish line, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Utah and your commitment to your constituents to change the debt culture, I think will be addressed in a very meaningful way with a fiscal state of the nation. And I commend you for your leadership and your persistence on this. And today is a great day as we consider it. And with that, I would ask if Mr. Boyle, the ranking member, has any comments, and we'll yield 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in the interest of showing that we can be constructive and showing that I genuinely believe we can work on a bipartisan basis to craft some solutions around here to what both Jody and I, or both the chairman and I, have said is an entirely dysfunctional, broken budget process from soup to nuts. I want to be supportive and will be supporting Mr. Moore's bill. So I commend him. I know he has a passion for this issue in particular, and so I will be supportive. And with that, I will yield as much time as he may consume, or the remainder of the time, I should say, to my friend from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you for including this in the markup today, Mr. Chairman. I'm co-leading the Fiscal State of the Nation Act with Congressman Moore, Panetta, and Barr because we need to make sure that lawmakers are equipped with the most current and impartial data on the federal budget. The bill would require the Comptroller General to present an accounting of the budget to a joint meeting of Congress. Congressman Barr and I have nearly identical resolution with 32 bipartisan co-sponsors that's before the Rules Committee. Our resolution passed the House last Congress, and we'll continue to push that to get that done again this time as well. But it's clear as ever that we need to deal with our national debt in a responsible and nonpartisan way. This legislation will cut through the noise of biased information that we members of Congress receive daily and instead give us a sober, thorough, and accurate analysis of how current and future policies influence our fiscal health. Right now, the American people want to know that Congress is taking the impending crisis seriously. I'm really encouraged that this committee is taking it seriously. This is a good step, and we can take to show them that we are. And I appreciate the time. Yield back.
Mr. Peters, thank you for your leadership on this, and I'm excited about it. Did y'all know we hadn't passed a piece of legislation that hadn't, outside of the resolution, in about a decade? And I think after, as we've said, many years, and you've made note of this and have said it perfectly, if the 74 Act worked, we wouldn't have need for this, but there's just a multitude of obvious indications that it's not. So thank you, Scott. Since there are no amendments, I move that H.R. 6952. Okay, I'm going to go back to Mr. Blakemore from Utah for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for following the scripts so responsibly. I move that
Scary
H.R.
as a gun.
6592 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6952 is ordered, reported to the House with favorable recommendation. Congratulations, gentlemen. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6957. Not 52, 6957. This is the Debt to GDP Transparency and Stabilization Act, led by our colleagues Lloyd Smucker of Pennsylvania and Jared Golden of Maine. Appreciate their efforts and their good work here, this bill would provide for more information about our growing debt crisis. Just a quick commentary. The more meaningful metric here is not the nominal amount of debt. It's just any more than it would be the debt of an individual or a family. It's what underwriters consider the ability to repay. In this case, it's not debt to income, it's debt to GDP, our capacity and wherewithal to pay the interest, service the debt, and pay the debt. And Mr. Smucker has been relentless about reminding us that is the more important and more meaningful metric, and we need to socialize that in the minds of and hearts of, I think, lawmakers and the American people. It also helps us compare our nation's indebtedness over time and compare our nation's indebtedness to other countries. And then I think it's also important to note, and I think both sides have embraced this, it's not just the debt and the deficit, it's also growth and how we grow this economy that can help bring that down and put us on better financial footing. So thank you again for that. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with, that the bill be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection, so ordered. Under the bipartisan agreement I've reached with Ranking Member Boyle, there'll be up to 10 minutes of debate on H.R. 6957. And now I yield 5 minutes to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce this bill and have this bill included in today's markup. And you said it very well, Mr. Chairman. This bill's really simple. It just simply adds another measure that is an appropriate measure to evaluate our debt historically, with levels of debt in the past compared to the economy at that time, and also evaluate our debt compared to other countries. This is a typical measure that is used in measuring the fiscal soundness of other countries as well across the world. And so this bill, it would just simply require that the President's annual budget submission to Congress and any concurrent resolution on the budget would include that ratio of the public debt, the impact of his proposed budget on the debt to GDP ratio. It would provide greater transparency, greater insight into the government's debt problem and its approach to managing that debt relative to the overall economic output of the United States. As I said, it's a preferred measure for the Congressional Budget Office. It's preferred by think tanks that report on the national debt, and it's used around the world to compare the debt of one country to another. The budget process is confusing enough as it is. We should be as straightforward as we possibly can with the American people about how we're spending their money. So requiring the President and Congress to includes this measure when they're talking about budgets would simply allow the American people to have a better understanding and to check our math, frankly, as well. So the fiscal mission that we're voting on today already includes a requirement for the commission to recommend its targets in terms of debt to GDP. And this just builds on that to require that President and Congress include this number in their proposed budgets. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this bill included. I yield back the balance of my time.
As the first year of my chairmanship, it didn't take you long to get that GDP metric into the discussion. I mean, you have been dogged about that, and rightfully so. I'm excited about making our conversations more meaningful and having a clearer picture for everybody, regardless of our opinions on how to get there to reduce the debt to GDP. So with that, I would like to yield 5 minutes to my ranking member for any comments that he has.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my friend from my fellow Pennsylvanian. Just a few points, though, I do want to make about this simple, very straightforward bill, just one page. First is this information does already exist. I mean, the debt to GDP ratio is already reported in the S10 tables of the president's budget. So if you go to OMB FY24 president's budget, you go to table S10 and it reports not just, because of course there are actually several different ways you can calculate debt to GDP. Their table lists all of them. So that information is already there. Further, the budget committees, both House and Senate, also already report this measure. In fact, it was included in our Republican colleagues' FY24 resolution. My more serious reservations is that, are as follows. While the debt to GDP ratio is important, it is meaningless without context. And what I mean is, obviously, since it's a ratio, there are two different ways that can dramatically change on the numerator side on the debt, but also on the denominator side, on the GDP. There have been two examples in the last 15 years when the debt to GDP ratio changed dramatically, not because of some dramatic increase in our debt, but because of a major change to the economy. The first was the Great Recession, as it hit in fall of 2008. And then the second, of course, was the dramatic contraction due to the pandemic beginning in the spring of 2020. If you just looked at debt to GDP ratio, you would have seen a dramatic increase, in that ratio, which would make it seem as if we had increased our debt when in fact we had not substantially. I am concerned that if we ever got to the point where debt to GDP was used as a trigger, that it would lead us to cut spending in a recession, which is exactly the wrong time to cut spending. Economists on both sides of the aisle would agree that the time to ramp up government spending is during an economic slowdown, and then ideally cut back and pull back on spending and turn toward deficit reduction when you're experiencing a time of economic expansion. So those would be my reservations. I would guard against, while debt to GDP, again, can be a helpful measure, let's keep in mind there are many different ways to calculate it. By one debt to GDP measure, we're at 123%, while by another, we're at just 26%. But let's not just look at debt to GDP as if that's the be-all and end-all. That overall context is incredibly important. And with that, I yield back.
Just one more point on the growth side, and there are ideas that should be considered and debated in the context of Congress and this commission about the role of growth or the ways we get at growth or encourage growth, foster growth. But if we create the conditions for growing this economy by 1% over the 2% that CBO projects, that's $3 trillion, for example, in real savings. So I think it's a good idea, and I appreciate the comments. And now I will commence to There are no amendments, since there aren't any amendments.
I yield back to balance my time.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Okay, I move that H.R. 6957 be reported to the House with no recommendation that with the recommendation that the bill passes. Question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Pursuant to the bipartisan agreement, we will now complete consideration of H.R. 5779. Before voting to report the bill to the House, the committee will vote on all postponed votes on amendments to H.R. 5779. We had four amendments. Number one, amendment from Mr. Boyle. The committee will now vote on Mr. Boyle's amendment. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1 on Social Security offered by Ranking Member Boyle.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman.
No.
Mr. Norman, no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman.
No.
Mr. Grothman, no. Mr. Smucker. No. Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, no. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, no. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, no. Mrs. McLean. Mrs. McLean, no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Yocum.
No.
Mr. Yocum, no. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, no. Mr. Boyle.
Aye.
Mr. Boyle, aye. Mr. Higgins.
Aye.
Mr. Higgins, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Aye. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Are there any members who wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Twelve ayes, 20 noes.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Let's move now to vote on the second amendment offered by Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2 on Medicare offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman?
No.
Mr. Norman? No. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Good? Mr. Good? No. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman? No. Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Ferguson? No. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore? No. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes? No. Mrs. McLean? Mrs. McLean? No. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Yocum?
No.
Mr. Yocum? No. Mr. Bakeen? Mr. Bakeen? No. Mr. Edwards? Mr. Edwards? No. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle? Aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins? Aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky? Aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? Aye. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee? Aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Lee? Ms. Lee? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett? Aye. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta? No. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton? Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar? Aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant? Aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Chairman?
No. Are there any members who haven't voted or wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 12 ayes, 20 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The committee will now vote on the amendment. This would be the third amendment offered by Mr. Higgins from New York. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 3 on taxes offered by Mr. Higgins.
Don't ever count a Texan out. I mean, don't ever count a Texan out. We closed the amendment. Is there a way she could vote on her amendment? You know, I'd like to, Ms. Jackson Lee, but we closed the amendment. But since I'm chairman, for the record, I think Ms. Jackson Lee would have voted to support her amendment that she presented. So with that, clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman? No. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman? No. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Carter? Mr. Klein? Mr. Good? Mr. Good? No. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman? No. Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Ferguson? No. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore? No. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes? No. Mrs. McLean? Mrs. McLean? No. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Yocum?
No.
Mr. Yocum? No. Mr. Bakeen? Mr. Bakeen? No. Mr. Edwards? Mr. Boyle? Aye. Mr. Boyle? Aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins? Aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee, aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No. Are there any members who haven't voted or wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 13 ayes, 20 nays.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The committee will now vote on the amendment. This would be the fourth and final amendment offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 4 on the tax gap offered by Mr. Scott.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, no. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, no. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Valadao. Mr. Valadao. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, no. Mrs. McLean. Mrs. McLean, no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, no. Mr. Bakeen. Mr. Bakeen, no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, no. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle, aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee, aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Are there any members who wish to change their vote? Members who haven't voted? If not, clerk, please report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 13 ayes, 20 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Jackson Lee.
I'd ask respectfully reconsideration of Jackson Lee amendment.
The reconsideration is not in order. Is there any way that the members could vote to reconsider so she can cast a vote for her amendment? She walked in seconds late. We're all busy people. Is there any way? Okay. Ms. Jackson Lee, again, as the chairman, I would say for the record, you were committed to your amendment. It was well articulated by you, and I know you believe wholeheartedly in it, but we can't change the rules, so.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if you would yield, if I was present.
Yes.
And ask unanimous consent to accept my aye vote, but I was in judiciary in the middle of an amendment that I walked away from to get here as fast as my legs would carry me.
It's noted for the record. Thank you, Ms. Jackson Lee. Now, let me recognize Bill Huizinga, since he's a co-chair of this. Mr. Huizinga, would you stand and be recognized from Michigan? He's one of the co-sponsors with Scott Peters of the H.R. 5779. Thank you for your leadership. Okay, within our final portion here, I now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yakum, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5779, as amended, be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
I wasn't sure if I needed to request.
Yep.
Yeah, I request.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman.
Yay.
Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy.
Aye.
Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore.
Aye.
Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Mrs. McLean. Mrs. McLean, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yakum. Mr. Yakum, aye. Mr. Bakeen. Mr. Bakeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle, no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee. Mr. Doggett.
Not yet, no.
Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, no. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee, no. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, no. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Chairman.
No. Yes, I mean, just wanted to see if y'all were, wake up, Espaillat. Wake up, Scott.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm a strong yes. I'm a
Aye.
Texas yes. I'm a hell yes. In the opinion, are there any members who want to change their vote or haven't voted?
Would you like to change your vote?
I would not. I am a yes. Get a final tally, Mr. Chapman?
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 22 ayes, 12 nays.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 5779 is ordered reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. I note for the record that a quorum is present. Without objection, staff are authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. So ordered.
And Mr. Chairman, I request the requisite number of days to submit minority views.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to submit the following in the record. Letters to both of us from the American Federation of Government Employees, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and First Focus Campaign for Children. Letters to all representatives from the AFL-CIO, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the AARP, and lastly, letters from the National Education Association and the Communications Workers of America.
Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to submit for the record, there were a number of outside groups and stakeholders who have been working on this issue for many years, if not decades, who have contributed to this final bill. We've made, you know, as they say, if all you can do is crawl, start crawling. We did a lot of crawling today in the right direction, thanks to American Consumer Institute, Center for Citizen Research, Americans for Prosperity, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Cato Institute, Citizens Against Government Waste, Committee for Responsible Budget, Consumer Action for Strong Economy, Heritage Action, Freedom Works, Peter Peterson Foundation. There's a number of others, including the Tax Foundation, the Association of Mature American Citizens. That would be appropriate, that we act like mature adults and leaders and actually solve a problem together. Together. You guys make me proud. This was a good hearing. This was a productive conversation. And who says that Congress can't function and do something positive for the American people? For the last word, I'll give, other than the ranking member, Mr. Peters.
Mr. Chairman, I had asked to have something entered into the record. I don't believe I gave you time to rule on it, but I would ask unanimous consent that the record include the article by Paul Krugman, October 10th, 2023, entitled "Why We Should But Won't Reduce the Budget Deficit."
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Ranking Member, any comments before we close it out?
No, I do commend the authors of the Fiscal Commission Act that passed, and look forward to hopefully continuing our work in the weeks and months ahead to reform our budget process. With that, I yield back to you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The committee stands adjourned.